The History of Mary Prince. A West Indian Slave. Related by herself. I was born at Brackish Pond, in Bermuda, on a farm belonging to Mr. Charles Miners. My mother was a household slave. And my father, whose name was Prince, was a sawyer belonging to Mr. Trimmingham, a shipbuilder at Crow Lane. When I was an infant, old Mr. Miners died, and there was a division of the slaves and other property among the family. I was bought along with my mother by old Captain Darrell, and given to his grandchild, little Miss Betsy Williams. Captain Williams, Mr. Darrell's son-in-law, was master of a vessel which traded to several places in America and the West Indies, and he was seldom at home long together. Mrs. Williams was a kind-hearted good woman, and she treated all her slaves well. She had only one daughter, Miss Betsy, for whom I was purchased, and who was about my own age. I was made quite a pet of by Miss Betsy, and loved her very much. She used to lead me about by the hand, and call me her little nigger. This was the happiest period of my life, for I was too young to understand rightly my condition as a slave, and too thoughtless and full of spirits to look forward to the days of toil and sorrow. My mother was a household slave in the same family. I was under her own care, and my little brothers and sisters were my playfellows and companions. My mother had several fine children after she came to Mrs. Williams, 3 girls and 2 boys. The tasks given out to us children were light, and we used to play together with Miss Betsy, with as much freedom almost as if she had been our sister. My master, however, was a very harsh, selfish man, and we always dreaded his return from sea. His wife was herself much afraid of him, and, during his stay at home, seldom dared to shew her usual kindness to the slaves. He often left her, in the most distressed circumstances, to reside in other female society, at some place in the West Indies of which I have forgot the name. My poor mistress bore his ill treatment with great patience, and all her slaves loved and pitied her. I was truly attached to her, and, next to my own mother, loved her better than any creature in the world. My obedience to her commands was cheerfully given, it sprung solely from the affection I felt for her, and not from fear of the power which the white people's law had given her over me. I had scarcely reached my 12th year when my mistress became too poor to keep so many of us at home, and she hired me out to Mrs. Pruden, a lady who lived about 5 miles off, in the adjoining parish, in a large house near the sea. I cried bitterly at parting with my dear mistress and Miss Betsy, and when I kissed my mother and brothers and sisters, I thought my young heart would break, it pained me so. But there was no help, I was forced to go. Good Mrs. Williams comforted me by saying that I should still be near the home I was about to quit, and might come over and see her and my kindred whenever I could obtain leave of absence from Mrs. Pruden. A few hours after this I was taken to a strange house, and found myself among strange people. This separation seemed a sore trial to me then, but oh! 'Twas light to the trials I have since endured. 'Twas nothing to be mentioned with them, but I was a child then, and it was according to my strength. I knew that Mrs. Williams could no longer maintain me, that she was fain to part with me for my food and clothing. And I tried to submit myself to the change. My new mistress was a passionate woman, but yet she did not treat me very unkindly. I do not remember her striking me but once, and that was for going to see Mrs. Williams when I heard she was sick, and staying longer than she had given me leave to do. All my employment at this time was nursing a sweet baby, little Master Daniel. And I grew so fond of my nursling that it was my greatest delight to walk out with him by the seashore, accompanied by his brother and sister, Miss Fanny and Master James. Dear Miss Fanny. She was a sweet, kind young lady, and so fond of me that she wished me to learn all that she knew herself. And her method of teaching me was as follows: directly she had said her lessons to her grandmamma, she used to come running to me, and make me repeat them one by one after her. And in a few months I was able not only to say my letters but to spell many small words. But this happy state was not to last long. Those days were too pleasant to last. My heart always softens when I think of them. At this time Mrs. Williams died. I was told suddenly of her death, and my grief was so great that, forgetting I had the baby in my arms, I ran away directly to my poor mistress's house, but reached it only in time to see the corpse carried out. Oh, that was a day of sorrow, a heavy day. All the slaves cried. My mother cried and lamented her sore, and I, foolish creature, vainly entreated them to bring my dear mistress back to life. I knew nothing rightly about death then, and it seemed a hard thing to bear. When I thought about my mistress I felt as if the world was all gone wrong, and for many days and weeks I could think of nothing else. I returned to Mrs. Pruden's. But my sorrow was too great to be comforted, for my own dear mistress was always in my mind. Whether in the house or abroad, my thoughts were always talking to me about her. I stayed at Mrs. Pruden's about 3 months after this. I was then sent back to Mr. Williams to be sold. Oh, that was a sad, sad time. I recollect the day well. Mrs. Pruden came to me and said, "Mary, you will have to go home directly. Your master is going to be married, and he means to sell you and 2 of your sisters to raise money for the wedding." Hearing this I burst out a-crying, though I was then far from being sensible of the full weight of my misfortune, or of the misery that waited for me. Besides, I did not like to leave Mrs. Pruden, and the dear baby, who had grown very fond of me. For some time I could scarcely believe that Mrs. Pruden was in earnest, till I received orders for my immediate return to dear Miss Fanny. How she cried at parting with me, whilst I kissed and hugged the baby, thinking I should never see him again. I left Mrs. Pruden's, and walked home with a heart full of sorrow. The idea of being sold away from my mother and Miss Betsy was so frightful, that I dared not trust myself to think about it. We had been bought of Mr. Miners, as I have mentioned, by Miss Betsy's grandfather, and given to her, so that we were by right her property, and I never thought we should be separated or sold away from her. When I reached the house, I went in directly to Miss Betsy. I found her in great distress, and she cried out as soon as she saw me, "Oh, Mary! My father is going to sell you all to raise money to marry that wicked woman. You are my slaves, and he has no right to sell you, but it is all to please her." She then told me that my mother was living with her father's sister at a house close by, and I went there to see her. It was a sorrowful meeting, and we lamented with a great and sore crying our unfortunate situation. "Here comes one of my poor pickaninnies," she said, the moment I came in, "one of the poor slave brood who are to be sold tomorrow. Oh dear! I cannot bear to think of that day, it is too much. It recalls the great grief that filled my heart, and the woeful thoughts that passed to and fro through my mind, whilst listening to the pitiful words of my poor mother, weeping for the loss of her children. I wish I could find words to tell you all I then felt and suffered. The great God above alone knows the thoughts of the poor slave's heart, and the bitter pains which follow such separations as these. All that we love taken away from us, oh, it is sad, sad. And sore to be borne. I got no sleep that night for thinking of the morrow, and dear Miss Betsy was scarcely less distressed. She could not bear to part with her old playmates, and she cried sore and would not be pacified. The black morning at length came. It came too soon for my poor mother and us. Whilst she was putting on us the new Osnaburgs in which we were to be sold, she said, in a sorrowful voice, "I shall never forget it. See, I am shrouding my poor children, what a task for a mother." She then called Miss Betsy to take leave of us. "I am going to carry my little chickens to market," these were her very words. "Take your last look of them, maybe you will see them no more." Oh, my poor slaves! "My own slaves," said dear Miss Betsy, "you belong to me. And it grieves my heart to part with you." Miss Betsy kissed us all, and, when she left us, my mother called the rest of the slaves to bid us good-bye. One of them, a woman named Moll, came with her infant in her arms. "I," said my mother, seeing her turn away and look at her child with the tears in her eyes, "your turn will come next." The slaves could say nothing to comfort us. They could only weep and lament with us. When I left my dear little brothers in the house in which I had been brought up, I thought my heart would burst. Our mother, weeping as she went, called me away with the children Hannah and Dinah, and we took the road that led to Hamble Town, which we reached about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We followed my mother to the marketplace, where she placed us in a row against a large house, with our backs to the wall and our arms folded across our breasts. I, as the eldest, stood first, Hannah next to me, then Dinah. And our mother stood beside, crying over us. My heart throbbed with grief and terror so violently, that I pressed my hands quite tightly across my breast, but I could not keep it still, and it continued to leap as though it would burst out of my body. But who cared for that? Did one of the many bystanders, who were looking at us so carelessly, think of the pain that wrung the hearts of the Negro woman and her young ones? No, no. They were not all bad, I dare say. But slavery hardens white people's hearts towards the blacks, and many of them were not slow to make their remarks upon us aloud, without regard to our grief, though their light words fell like cayenne on the fresh wounds of our hearts. Oh, those white people have small hearts who can only feel for themselves. At length the Vendu master, who was to offer us for sale like sheep or cattle, arrived, and asked my mother which was the eldest. She said nothing, but pointed to me. He took me by the hand, and led me out into the middle of the street, and, turning me slowly round, exposed me to the view of those who attended the Vendu. I was soon surrounded by strange men, who examined and handled me in the same manner that a butcher would a calf or a lamb he was about to purchase. And who talked about my shape and size in like words, as if I could no more understand their meaning than the dumb beasts. I was then put up to sale. The bidding commenced at a few pounds, and gradually rose to 57, when I was knocked down to the highest bidder, and the people who stood by said that I had fetched a great sum for so young a slave. I then saw my sisters led forth, and sold to different owners, so that we had not the sad satisfaction of being partners in bondage. When the sale was over, my mother hugged and kissed us, and mourned over us, begging of us to keep up a good heart, and do our duty to our new masters. It was a sad parting, one went one way, one another, and our poor mammy went home with nothing. My new master was a Captain I, who lived at Spanish Point. After parting with my mother and sisters, I followed him to his store, and he gave me into the charge of his son, a lad about my own age, Master Benji, who took me to my new home. I did not know where I was going, or what my new master would do with me. My heart was quite broken with grief, and my thoughts went back continually to those from whom I had been so suddenly parted. Oh, my mother! My mother! I kept saying to myself, oh, my mammy and my sisters and my brothers, shall I never see you again? Oh, the trials! The trials! They make the salt water come into my eyes when I think of the days in which I was afflicted, the times that are gone. When I mourned and grieved with a young heart for those whom I loved. It was night when I reached my new home. The house was large, and built at the bottom of a very high hill, but I could not see much of it that night. I saw too much of it afterwards. The stones and the timber were the best things in it, they were not so hard as the hearts of the owners. Before I entered the house, 2 slave women, hired from another owner, who were at work in the yard, spoke to me, and asked who I belonged to. I replied, I am come to live here. Poor child, they both said. You must keep a good heart, if you are to live here. When I went in, I stood up crying in a corner. Mrs. I came and took off my hat, a little black silk hat Miss Pruden made for me, and said in a rough voice, You are not come here to stand up in corners and cry, you are come here to work. She then put a child into my arms, and, tired as I was forced instantly to take up my old occupation of a nurse. I could not bear to look at my mistress, her countenance was so stern. She was a stout tall woman with a very dark complexion, and her brows were always drawn together into a frown. I thought of the words of the 2 slave women when I saw Mrs. I, and heard the harsh sound of her voice. The person I took the most notice of that night was a French black called Hetty, whom my master took in privateering from another vessel, and made his slave. She was the most active woman I ever saw, and she was tasked to her utmost. A few minutes after my arrival she came in from milking the cows, and put the sweet potatoes on for supper. She then fetched home the sheep, and penned them in the fold, drove home the cattle, and staked them about the pond side. Fed and rubbed down my master's horse, and gave the hog and the fed cow their suppers, prepared the beds, and undressed the children, and laid them to sleep. I liked to look at her and watch all her doings, for hers was the only friendly face I had as yet seen, and I felt glad that she was there. She gave me my supper of potatoes and milk, and a blanket to sleep upon, which she spread for me in the passage before the door of Mrs. I.'s chamber. I got a sad fright that night. I was just going to sleep, when I heard a noise in my mistress's room, and she presently called out to inquire if some work was finished that she had ordered Hetty to do. "No, ma'am, not yet," was Hetty's answer from below. On hearing this, my master started up from his bed, and just as he was, in his shirt, ran downstairs with a long cow skin in his hand. I heard immediately after, the cracking of the thong, and the house rang to the shrieks of poor Hetty, who kept crying out, "Oh, massa! Massa! Me dead! Massa! Have mercy upon me, don't kill me outright." This was a sad beginning for me. I sat up upon my blanket, trembling with terror, like a frightened hound, and thinking that my turn would come next. At length the house became still, and I forgot for a little while all my sorrows by falling fast asleep. The next morning my mistress set about instructing me in my tasks. She taught me to do all sorts of household work, to wash and bake, pick cotton and wool, and wash floors, and cook. And she taught me, how can I ever forget it? More things than these. She caused me to know the exact difference between the smart of the rope, the cart whip, and the cow skin, when applied to my naked body by her own cruel hand. And there was scarcely any punishment more dreadful than the blows I received on my face and head from her hard heavy fist. She was a fearful woman, and a savage mistress to her slaves. There were 2 little slave boys in the house, on whom she vented her bad temper in a special manner. One of these children was a mulatto, called Cyrus, who had been bought while an infant in his mother's arms. The other, Jack, was an African from the coast of Guinea, whom a sailor had given or sold to my master. Seldom a day passed without these boys receiving the most severe treatment, and often for no fault at all. Both my master and mistress seemed to think that they had a right to ill-use them at their pleasure, and very often accompanied their commands with blows, whether the children were behaving well or ill. I have seen their flesh ragged and raw with licks. Lick, lick. They were never secure one moment from a blow, and their lives were passed in continual fear. My mistress was not contented with using the whip, but often pinched their cheeks and arms in the most cruel manner. My pity for these poor boys was soon transferred to myself. For I was licked, and flogged, and pinched by her pitiless fingers in the neck and arms, exactly as they were. To strip me naked, to hang me up by the wrists and lay my flesh open with the cow skin, was an ordinary punishment for even a slight offense. My mistress often robbed me too of the hours that belonged to sleep. She used to sit up very late, frequently even until morning, and I had then to stand at a bench and wash during the greater part of the night, or pick wool and cotton. And often I have dropped down overcome by sleep and fatigue, till roused from a state of stupor by the whip, and forced to start up to my tasks. Poor Hetty, my fellow slave, was very kind to me, and I used to call her my aunt. But she led a most miserable life, and her death was hastened, at least the slaves all believed and said so, by the dreadful chastisement she received from my master during her pregnancy. It happened as follows. One of the cows had dragged the rope away from the stake to which Hetty had fastened it, and got loose. My master flew into a terrible passion, and ordered the poor creature to be stripped quite naked, notwithstanding her pregnancy, and to be tied up to a tree in the yard. He then flogged her as hard as he could lick, both with the whip and cow skin, till she was all over streaming with blood. He rested, and then beat her again and again. Her shrieks were terrible. The consequence was that poor Hetty was brought to bed before her time, and was delivered after severe labor of a dead child. She appeared to recover after her confinement, so far that she was repeatedly flogged by both master and mistress afterwards, but her former strength never returned to her. Ere long her body and limbs swelled to a great size. And she lay on a mat in the kitchen, till the water burst out of her body and she died. All the slaves said that death was a good thing for poor Hetty, but I cried very much for her death. The manner of it filled me with horror. I could not bear to think about it, yet it was always present to my mind for many a day. After Hetty died all her labors fell upon me, in addition to my own. I had now to milk 11 cows every morning before sunrise, sitting among the damp weeds. To take care of the cattle as well as the children, and to do the work of the house. There was no end to my toils, no end to my blows. I lay down at night and rose up in the morning in fear and sorrow. And often wished that like poor Hetty I could escape from this cruel bondage and be at rest in the grave. But the hand of that God whom then I knew not, was stretched over me, and I was mercifully preserved for better things. It was then, however, my heavy lot to weep, 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 and that for years, to pass from one misery to another, and from one cruel master to a worse. But I must go on with the thread of my story. One day a heavy squall of wind and rain came on suddenly, and my mistress sent me round the corner of the house to empty a large earthen jar. The jar was already cracked with an old deep crack that divided it in the middle, and in turning it upside down to empty it, it parted in my hand. I could not help the accident, but I was dreadfully frightened, looking forward to a severe punishment. I ran crying to my mistress, "Oh mistress, the jar has come in too." "You have broken it, have you?" she replied. "Come directly here to me." I came trembling. She stripped and flogged me long and severely with the cow skin, as long as she had strength to use the lash, for she did not give over till she was quite tired. When my master came home at night, she told him of my fault. And oh, frightful! How he fell a-swearing. After abusing me with every ill name he could think of, too bad to speak in England, and giving me several heavy blows with his hand, he said, "I shall come home tomorrow morning at 12, on purpose to give you a round 100. He kept his word. Oh, sad for me! I cannot easily forget it. He tied me up upon a ladder, and gave me 100 lashes with his own hand, and Master Benjy stood by to count them for him. When he had licked me for some time he sat down to take breath. Then after resting, he beat me again and again, until he was quite wearied, and so hot, for the weather was very sultry, that he sank back in his chair, almost like to faint. While my mistress went to bring him drink, there was a dreadful earthquake. Part of the roof fell down, and everything in the house went, clatter, clatter, clatter. Oh, I thought the end of all things near at hand. And I was so sore with the flogging, that I scarcely cared whether I lived or died. The earth was groaning and shaking, everything tumbling about, and my mistress and the slaves were shrieking and crying out, "The earthquake! The earthquake!" It was an awful day for us all. During the confusion I crawled away on my hands and knees, and laid myself down under the steps of the piazza, in front of the house. I was in a dreadful state, my body all blood and bruises, and I could not help moaning piteously. The other slaves, when they saw me, shook their heads and said, "Poor child! Poor child!" I lay there till the morning, careless of what might happen, for life was very weak in me, and I wished more than ever to die. But when we are very young, death always seems a great way off, and it would not come that night to me. The next morning I was forced by my master to rise and go about my usual work, though my body and limbs were so stiff and sore, that I could not move without the greatest pain. Nevertheless, even after all this severe punishment, I never heard the last of that jar. My mistress was always throwing it in my face. Some little time after this, one of the cows got loose from the stake, and eat one of the sweet potato slips. I was milking when my master found it out. He came to me, and without any more ado, stooped down, and taking off his heavy boot, he struck me such a severe blow in the small of my back, that I shrieked with agony, and thought I was killed. And I feel a weakness in that part to this day. The cow was frightened at his violence, and kicked down the pail and spilt the milk all about. My master knew that this accident was his own fault, but he was so enraged that he seemed glad of an excuse to go on with his ill usage. I cannot remember how many licks he gave me then, but he beat me till I was unable to stand, until he himself was weary. After this I ran away and went to my mother, who was living with Mr. Richard Darrell. My poor mother was both grieved and glad to see me, grieved because I had been so ill-used, and glad because she had not seen me for a long, long while. She dared not receive me into the house, but she hid me up in a hole in the rocks near, and brought me food at night, after everybody was asleep. My father, who lived at Crow Lane, over the saltwater channel, at last heard of my being hid up in the cavern, and he came and took me back to my master. Oh, I was loath to go back, but as there was no remedy, I was obliged to submit. When we got home, my poor father said to Captain I, "Sir, I am sorry that my child should be forced to run away from her owner, but the treatment she has received is enough to break her heart. The sight of her wounds has nearly broke mine. I entreat you, for the love of God, to forgive her for running away, and that you will be a kind master to her in future." Captain I said I was used as well as I deserved, and that I ought to be punished for running away. I then took courage and said that I could stand the floggings no longer, that I was weary of my life, and therefore I had run away to my mother. But mothers could only weep and mourn over their children, they could not save them from cruel masters, from the whip, the rope, and the cowskin. He told me to hold my tongue and go about my work, or he would find a way to settle me. He did not, however, flog me that day. For 5 years after this I remained in his house, and almost daily received the same harsh treatment. At length he put me on board a sloop, and to my great joy sent me away to Turk's Island. I was not permitted to see my mother or father, or poor sisters and brothers, to say goodbye, though going away to a strange land, and might never see them again. Oh, the Bukra people who keep slaves think that black people are like cattle, without natural affection. But my heart tells me it is far otherwise. We were nearly 4 weeks on the voyage, which was unusually long. Sometimes we had a light breeze, sometimes a great calm, and the ship made no way, so that our provisions and water ran very low, and we were put upon short allowance. I should almost have been starved had it not been for the kindness of a black man called Anthony, and his wife, who had brought their own victuals, and shared them with me. When we went ashore at the Grand Quay, the captain sent me to the house of my new master, Mr. D., to whom Captain I had sold me. Grand Quay is a small town upon a sandbank, the houses low and built of wood. Such was my new master's. The first person I saw, on my arrival, was Mr. D., a stout sulky-looking man, who carried me through the hall to show me to his wife and children. Next day I was put up by the Vendu master to know how much I was worth, and I was valued at £100 currency. My new master was one of the owners or holders of the salt ponds, and he received a certain sum for every slave that worked upon his premises, whether they were young or old. This sum was allowed him out of the profits arising from the salt works. I was immediately sent to work in the salt water with the rest of the slaves. This work was perfectly new to me. I was given a half barrel and a shovel, and had to stand up to my knees in the water, from 4 o'clock in the morning till 9, when we were given some Indian corn boiled in water, which we were obliged to swallow as fast as we could for fear the rain should come on and melt the salt. We were then called again to our tasks, and worked through the heat of the day, the sun flaming upon our heads like fire, and raising salt blisters in those parts which were not completely covered. Our feet and legs, from standing in the salt water for so many hours, soon became full of dreadful boils, which eat down in some cases to the very bone, afflicting the sufferers with great torment. We came home at 12. Ate our corn soup, called blolly, as fast as we could, and went back to our employment till dark at night. We then shoveled up the salt in large heaps, and went down to the sea, where we washed the pickle from our limbs, and cleaned the barrows and shovels from the salt. When we returned to the house, our master gave us each our allowance of raw Indian corn, which we pounded in a mortar and boiled in water for our suppers. We slept in a long shed, divided into narrow slips, like the stalls used for cattle. Boards fixed upon stakes driven into the ground, without mat or covering, were our only beds. On Sundays, after we had washed the salt bags, and done other work required of us, we went into the bush and cut the long soft grass, of which we made trusses for our legs and feet to rest upon. For they were so full of the salt boils that we could get no rest lying upon the bare boards. Though we worked from morning till night, there was no satisfying Mr. D. I hoped, when I left Captain I, that I should have been better off, but I found it was but going from one butcher to another. There was this difference between them: my former master used to beat me while raging and foaming with passion. Mr. D. was usually quite calm. He would stand by and give orders for a slave to be cruelly whipped, and assist in the punishment, without moving a muscle of his face, walking about and taking snuff with the greatest composure. Nothing could touch his hard heart, neither sighs, nor tears, nor prayers, nor streaming blood, He was deaf to our cries, and careless of our sufferings. Mr. D has often stripped me naked, hung me up by the wrists, and beat me with the cow skin, with his own hand, till my body was raw with gashes. Yet there was nothing very remarkable in this. For it might serve as a sample of the common usage of the slaves on that horrible island. Owing to the boils in my feet, I was unable to wheel the barrow fast through the sand, which got into the sores, and made me stumble at every step. And my master, having no pity for my sufferings from this cause, rendered them far more intolerable, by chastising me for not being able to move so fast as he wished me. Another of our employments was to row a little way off from the shore in a boat, and dive for large stones to build a wall round our master's house. This was very hard work. And the great waves breaking over us continually, made us often so giddy that we lost our footing, and were in danger of being drowned. Ah, poor me, my tasks were never ended. Sick or well, it was work, work, work. After the diving season was over, we were sent to the South Creek, with large bills, to cut up mangoes to burn lime with. Whilst one party of slaves were thus employed, another were sent to the other side of the island to break up coral out of the sea. When we were ill, let our complaint be what it might, the only medicine given to us was a great bowl of hot salt water, with salt mixed with it, which made us very sick. If we could not keep up with the rest of the gang of slaves, we were put in the stocks, and severely flogged the next morning. Yet, not the less, our master expected, after we had thus been kept from our rest, and our limbs rendered stiff and sore with ill usage, that we should still go through the ordinary tasks of the day all the same. Sometimes we had to work all night, measuring salt to load a vessel, or turning a machine to draw water out of the sea for the salt making. Then we had no sleep, no rest, but were forced to work as fast as we could, and go on again all next day the same as usual. Work, 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 oh that Turk's Island was a horrible place. The people in England, I am sure, have never found out what is carried on there. Cruel, horrible place. Mr. D had a slave called Old Daniel, whom he used to treat in the most cruel manner. Poor Daniel was lame in the hip, and could not keep up with the rest of the slaves, and our master would order him to be stripped and laid down on the ground, and have him beaten with a rod of rough briar till his skin was quite red and raw. He would then call for a bucket of salt, and fling upon the raw flesh till the man writhed on the ground like a worm, and screamed aloud with agony. This poor man's wounds were never healed, and I have often seen them full of maggots, which increased his torments to an intolerable degree. He was an object of pity and terror to the whole gang of slaves, and in his wretched case we saw, each of us, our own lot, if we should live to be as old. Oh, the horrors of slavery, how the thought of it pains my heart. But the truth ought to be told of it, and what my eyes have seen I think it is my duty to relate, for few people in England know what slavery is. I have been a slave, I have felt what a slave feels, and I know what a slave knows. And I would have all the good people in England to know it too, that they may break our chains, and set us free. Mr. D had another slave called Ben. He being very hungry, stole a little rice one night after he came in from work, and cooked it for his supper. But his master soon discovered the theft, locked him up all night, and kept him without food till 1 o'clock the next day. He then hung Ben up by his hands, and beat him from time to time till the slaves came in at night. We found the poor creature hung up when we came home, with a pool of blood beneath him, and our master still licking him. But this was not the worst. My master's son was in the habit of stealing the rice and rum. Ben had seen him do this, and thought he might do the same, and when master found out that Ben had stolen the rice and swore to punish him, he tried to excuse himself by saying that Master Dicky did the same thing every night. The lad denied it to his father, and was so angry with Ben for informing against him, that out of revenge he ran and got a bayonet, and whilst the poor wretch was suspended by his hands and writhing under his wounds, he run it quite through his foot. I was not by when he did it, but I saw the wound when I came home, and heard Ben tell the manner in which it was done. I must say something more about this cruel son of a cruel father. He had no heart, no fear of God. He had been brought up by a bad father in a bad path, and he delighted to follow in the same steps. There was a little old woman among the slaves called Sarah, who was nearly past work. And, Master Dickey being the overseer of the slaves just then, this poor creature, who was subject to several bodily infirmities, and was not quite right in her head, did not will the barrow fast enough to please him. He threw her down on the ground, and after beating her severely, he took her up in his arms and flung her among the prickly pear bushes, which are all covered over with sharp venomous prickles. By this her naked flesh was so grievously wounded, that her body swelled and festered all over, and she died a few days after. In telling my own sorrows, I cannot pass by those of my fellow slaves, for when I think of my own griefs, I remember theirs. I think it was about 10 years I had worked in the salt ponds at Turk's Island, when my master left off business, and retired to a house he had in Bermuda, leaving his son to succeed him in the island. He took me with him to wait upon his daughters. And I was joyful, for I was sick of Turk's Island, and my heart yearned to see my native place again, my mother, and my kindred. I had seen my poor mother during the time I was a slave in Turk's Island. One Sunday morning I was on the beach with some of the slaves, and we saw a sloop come in loaded with slaves to work in the salt water. We got a boat and went aboard. When I came upon the deck I asked the black people, "Is there anyone here for me?" "Yes," they said, "your mother." I thought they said this in jest. I could scarcely believe them for joy. But when I saw my poor mammy my joy was turned to sorrow, for she had gone from her senses. "Mammy," I said, "is this you?" She did not know me. "Mammy," I said, "what's the matter?" She began to talk foolishly, and said that she had been under the vessel's bottom. They had been overtaken by a violent storm at sea. My poor mother had never been on the sea before, and she was so ill, that she lost her senses, and it was long before she came quite to herself again. She had a sweet child with her, a little sister I had never seen, about 4 years of age, called Rebecca. I took her on shore with me, for I felt I should love her directly, and I kept her with me a week. Poor little thing. Hers has been a sad life, and continues so to this day. My mother worked for some years on the island, but was taken back to Bermuda some time before my master carried me again thither. After I left Turk's Island, I was told by some Negroes that came over from it, that the poor slaves had built up a place with boughs and leaves, where they might meet for prayers, but the white people pulled it down twice, and would not allow them even a shed for prayers. A flood came down soon after and washed away many houses, filled the place with sand, and overflowed the ponds, and I do think that this was for their wickedness, for the Buckra men there were very wicked. I saw and heard much that was very, very bad at that place. I was several years the slave of Mr. D, after I returned to my native place. Here I worked in the grounds. My work was planting and hoeing sweet potatoes, Indian corn, plantains, bananas, cabbages, pumpkins, onions, and I did all the household work, and attended upon a horse and cow besides, going also upon all errands. I had to curry the horse, to clean and feed him, and sometimes to ride him a little. I had more than enough to do, but still it was not so very bad as Turk's Island. My old master often got drunk, and then he would get in a fury with his daughter, and beat her till she was not fit to be seen. I remember on one occasion, I had gone to fetch water, and when I was coming up the hill I heard a great screaming. I ran as fast as I could to the house, put down the water, and went into the chamber, where I found my master beating Miss D, dreadfully. I strove with all my strength to get her away from him, for she was all black and blue with bruises. He had beat her with his fist, and almost killed her. The people gave me credit for getting her away. He turned round and began to lick me. Then I said, "Sir, this is not Turk's Island." I can't repeat his answer, the words were too wicked, too bad to say. He wanted to treat me the same in Bermuda as he had done in Turk's Island. He had an ugly fashion of stripping himself quite naked, and ordering me then to wash him in a tub of water. This was worse to me than all the licks. Sometimes when he called me to wash him I would not come, my eyes were so full of shame. He would then come to beat me. One time I had plates and knives in my hand, and I dropped both plates and knives, and some of the plates were broken. He struck me so severely for this, that at last I defended myself, for I thought it was high time to do so. I then told him I would not live longer with him, for he was a very indecent man, very spiteful, and too indecent. With no shame for his servants, no shame for his own flesh. So I went away to a neighboring house and sat down and cried till the next morning, when I went home again, not knowing what else to do. After that I was hired to work at Cedar Hills, and every Saturday night I paid the money to my master. I had plenty of work to do there, plenty of washing, but yet I made myself pretty comfortable. I earned $2.25 a week, which is 20 pence a day. During the time I worked there, I heard that Mr. John Wood was going to Antigua. I felt a great wish to go there, and I went to Mr. D, and asked him to let me go in Mr. Wood's service. Mr. Wood did not then want to purchase me. It was my own fault that I came under him. I was so anxious to go. It was ordained to be, I suppose. God led me there. The truth is, I did not wish to be any longer the slave of my indecent master. Mr. Wood took me with him to Antigua, to the town of St. John's, where he lived. This was about 15 years ago. He did not then know whether I was to be sold, but Mrs. Wood found that I could work, and she wanted to buy me. Her husband then wrote to my master to inquire whether I was to be sold. Mr. D wrote in reply that I should not be sold to anyone that would treat me ill. It was strange he should say this, when he had treated me so ill himself. So I was purchased by Mr. Wood for $300, or £100 Bermuda currency. My work there was to attend the chambers and nurse the child, and to go down to the pond and wash clothes. But I soon fell ill of the rheumatism, and grew so very lame that I was forced to walk with a stick. I got the St. Anthony's fire, also, in my left leg, and became quite a cripple. No one cared much to come near me, and I was ill a long time. For several months I could not lift the limb. I had to lie in a little old outhouse, that was swarming with bugs and other vermin, which tormented me greatly, but I had no other place to lie in. I got the rheumatism by catching cold at the pond side, from washing in the fresh water. In the salt water I never got cold. The person who lived in next yard, a Mrs. Green, could not bear to hear my cries and groans. She was kind, and used to send an old slave woman to help me, who sometimes brought me a little soup. When the doctor found I was so ill, he said I must be put into a bath of hot water. The old slave got the bark of some bush that was good for the pains, which she boiled in the hot water, and every night she came and put me into the bath, and did what she could for me. I don't know what I should have done, or what would have become of me, had it not been for her. My mistress, it is true, did send me a little food, but no one from our family came near me but the cook, who used to shove my food in at the door, and say, "Molly, Molly, there's your dinner." My mistress did not care to take any trouble about me. And if the Lord had not put it into the hearts of the neighbors to be kind to me, I must, I really think, have lain and died. It was a long time before I got well enough to work in the house. Mrs. Wood, in the meanwhile, hired a mulatto woman to nurse the child, but she was such a fine lady she wanted to be mistress over me. I thought it very hard for a colored woman to have rule over me because I was a slave and she was free. Her name was Martha Wilcox. She was a saucy woman, very saucy, and she went and complained of me, without cause, to my mistress, and made her angry with me. Mrs. Wood told me that if I did not mind what I was about, she would get my master to strip me and give me 50 lashes. "You have been used to the whip," she said, "and you shall have it here." This was the first time she threatened to have me flogged. And she gave me the threatening so strong of what she would have done to me, that I thought I should have fallen down at her feet. I was so vexed and hurt by her words. The mulatto woman was rejoiced to have power to keep me down. She was constantly making mischief. There was no living for the slaves, no peace after she came. I was also sent by Mrs. Wood to be put in the cage one night, and was next morning flogged, by the magistrate's order, at her desire. And this all for a quarrel I had about a pig with another slave woman. I was flogged on my naked back on this occasion, although I was in no fault after all. For old Justice Diet, when we came before him, said that I was in the right, and ordered the pig to be given to me. This was about 2 or 3 years after I came to Antigua. When we moved from the middle of the town to the point, I used to be in the house and do all the work and mind the children, though still very ill with the rheumatism. Every week I had to wash 2 large bundles of clothes, as much as a boy could help me to lift, but I could give no satisfaction. My mistress was always abusing and fretting after me. It is not possible to tell all her ill language. One day she followed me foot after foot, scolding and rating me. I bore in silence a great deal of ill words. At last my heart was quite full, and I told her that she ought not to use me so. That when I was ill I might have lain and died for what she cared, and no one would then come near me to nurse me, because they were afraid of my mistress. This was a great affront. She called her husband and told him what I had said. He flew into a passion, but did not beat me then. He only abused and swore at me, and then gave me a note and bade me go and look for an owner. Not that he meant to sell me, but he did this to please his wife and to frighten me. I went to Adam White, a cooper, a free black, who had money, and asked him to buy me. He went directly to Mr. Wood, but was informed that I was not to be sold. The next day my master whipped me. Another time, about 5 years ago, my mistress got vexed with me, because I fell sick and I could not keep on with my work. She complained to her husband, and he sent me off again to look for an owner. I went to a Mr. Burchell, showed him the note, and asked him to buy me for my own benefit, for I had saved about $100, and hoped, with a little help, to purchase my freedom. He accordingly went to my master, Mr. Wood. He said, "Molly has brought me a note that she wants an owner. If you intend to sell her, I may as well buy her as another." My master put him off and said that he did not mean to sell me. I was very sorry at this, for I had no comfort with Mrs. Wood, and I wished greatly to get my freedom. The way in which I made my money was this. When my master and mistress went from home, as they sometimes did, and left me to take care of the house and premises, I had a good deal of time to myself, and made the most of it. I took in washing, and sold coffee and yams and other provisions to the captains of ships. I did not sit still idling during the absence of my owners, for I wanted, by all honest means, to earn money to buy my freedom. Sometimes I bought a hog cheap on board ship, and sold it for double the money on shore, and I also earned a good deal by selling coffee. By this means I by degrees acquired a little cash. A gentleman also lent me some to help to buy my freedom, but when I could not get free he got it back again. His name was Captain Abbott. My master and mistress went on one occasion into the country, to Date Hill, for change of air, and carried me with them to take charge of the children, and to do the work of the house. While I was in the country, I saw how the field Negroes are worked in Antigua. They are worked very hard and fed but scantily. They are called out to work before daybreak, and come home after dark. And then each has to heave his bundle of grass for the cattle in the pen. Then, on Sunday morning, each slave has to go out and gather a large bundle of grass. And, when they bring it home, they have all to sit at the manager's door and wait till he come out. Often have they to wait there till past 11 o'clock, without any breakfast. After that, those that have yams or potatoes, or firewood to sell, hasten to market to buy a dog's worth of salt fish, or pork, which is a great treat for them. Some of them buy a little pickle out of the shed barrels, which they call sauce, to season their yams and Indian corn. It is very wrong, I know, to work on Sunday or go to market. But will not God call the Buckra men to answer for this on the great day of judgment, since they will give the slaves no other day? While we were at Date Hill, Christmas came. And the slave woman who had the care of the place, which then belonged to Mr. Roberts the marshal, asked me to go with her to her husband's house, to a Methodist meeting for prayer, at a plantation called Winthorpe's. I went. And they were the first prayers I ever understood. One woman prayed, and then they all sung a hymn, then there was another prayer and another hymn, and then they all spoke by turns of their own griefs as sinners. The husband of the woman I went with was a black driver. His name was Henry. He confessed that he had treated the slaves very cruelly, but said that he was compelled to obey the orders of his master. He prayed them all to forgive him, and he prayed that God would forgive him. He said it was a horrid thing for a ranger to have sometimes to beat his own wife or sister, but he must do so if ordered by his master. I felt sorry for my sins also. I cried the whole night, but I was too much ashamed to speak. I prayed God to forgive me. This meeting had a great impression on my mind, and led my spirit to the Moravian church. So that when I got back to town, I went and prayed to have my name put down in the missionary's book, and I followed the church earnestly every opportunity. I did not then tell my mistress about it, for I knew that she would not give me leave to go. But I felt I must go. Whenever I carried the children their lunch at school, I ran round and went to hear the teachers. The Moravian ladies, Mrs. Richter, Mrs. Olufsen, and Mrs. Sauter, taught me to read in the class, and I got on very fast. In this class there were all sorts of people, old and young, gray-headed folks and children, but most of them were free people. After we had done spelling, we tried to read in the Bible. After the reading was over, the missionary gave out a hymn for us to sing. I dearly loved to go to the church, it was so solemn. I never knew rightly that I had much sin till I went there. When I found out that I was a great sinner, I was very sorely grieved, and very much frightened. I used to pray God to pardon my sins for Christ's sake, and forgive me for everything I had done amiss. And when I went home to my work, I always thought about what I had heard from the missionaries, and wished to be good that I might go to heaven. After a while I was admitted a candidate for the Holy Communion. I had been baptized long before this, in August 1817, by the Reverend Mr. Curtin, of the English Church, after I had been taught to repeat the Creed and the Lord's Prayer. I wished at that time to attend a Sunday school taught by Mr. Curtin, but he would not receive me without a written note from my master, granting his permission. I did not ask my owner's permission, from the belief that it would be refused. So that I got no farther instruction at that time from the English Church. Some time after I began to attend the Moravian Church, I met with Daniel James, afterwards my dear husband. He was a carpenter and cooper to his trade. An honest, hard-working, decent black man, and a widower. He had purchased his freedom of his mistress, old Mrs. Baker, with money he had earned whilst a slave. When he asked me to marry him, I took time to consider the matter over with myself, and would not say yes till he went to church with me and joined the Moravians. He was very industrious after he bought his freedom. And he had hired a comfortable house, and had convenient things about him. We were joined in marriage, about Christmas 1826, in the Moravian chapel at Spring Gardens, by the Reverend Mr. Olufsen. We could not be married in the English Church. English marriage is not allowed to slaves, and no free man can marry a slave woman. When Mr. Wood heard of my marriage, he flew into a great rage, and sent for Daniel, who was helping to build a house for his old mistress. Mr. Wood asked him who gave him a right to marry a slave of his. My husband said, "Sir, I am a free man, and thought I had a right to choose a wife, but if I had known Molly was not allowed to have a husband, I should not have asked her to marry me." Mrs. Wood was more vexed about my marriage than her husband. She could not forgive me for getting married, but stirred up Mr. Wood to flog me dreadfully with the horsewhip. I thought it very hard to be whipped at my time of life for getting a husband. I told her so. She said that she would not have nigger men about the yards and premises, or allow a nigger man's clothes to be washed in the same tub where hers were washed. She was fearful, I think, that I should lose her time, in order to wash and do things for my husband, but I had then no time to wash for myself. I was obliged to put out my own clothes, though I was always at the wash-tub. I had not much happiness in my marriage, owing to my being a slave. It made my husband sad to see me so ill-treated. Mrs. Wood was always abusing me about him. She did not lick me herself, but she got her husband to do it for her, whilst she fretted the flesh off my bones. Yet for all this she would not sell me. She sold 5 slaves whilst I was with her. But though she was always finding fault with me, she would not part with me. However, Mr. Wood afterwards allowed Daniel to have a place to live in our yard, which we were very thankful for. After this, I fell ill again with the rheumatism, and was sick a long time, but whether sick or well, I had my work to do. About this time I asked my master and mistress to let me buy my own freedom. With the help of Mr. Burchell, I could have found the means to pay Mr. Wood, for it was agreed that I should afterwards serve Mr. Burchell a while, for the cash he was to advance for me. I was earnest in the request to my owners. But their hearts were hard, too hard to consent. Mrs. Wood was very angry. She grew quite outrageous. She called me a black devil, and asked me who had put freedom into my head. To be free is very sweet, I said, but she took good care to keep me a slave. I saw her change color, and I left the room. About this time my master and mistress were going to England to put their son to school, and bring their daughters home. And they took me with them to take care of the child. I was willing to come to England. I thought that by going there I should probably get cured of my rheumatism, and should return with my master and mistress, quite well, to my husband. My husband was willing for me to come away, for he had heard that my master would free me, and I also hoped this might prove true, but it was all a false report. The steward of the ship was very kind to me. He and my husband were in the same class in the Moravian church. I was thankful that he was so friendly, for my mistress was not kind to me on the passage. And she told me, when she was angry, that she did not intend to treat me any better in England than in the West Indies, that I need not expect it. And she was as good as her word. When we drew near to England, the rheumatism seized all my limbs worse than ever, and my body was dreadfully swelled. When we landed at the Tower, I shewed my flesh to my mistress, but she took no great notice of it. We were obliged to stop at the tavern till my master got a house, and a day or two after, my mistress sent me down into the wash-house to learn to wash in the English way. In the West Indies we wash with cold water, in England with hot. I told my mistress I was afraid that putting my hands first into the hot water and then into the cold, would increase the pain in my limbs. The doctor had told my mistress long before I came from the West Indies, that I was a sickly body and the washing did not agree with me. But Mrs. Wood would not release me from the tub, so I was forced to do as I could. I grew worse, and could not stand to wash. I was then forced to sit down with the tub before me, and often through pain and weakness was reduced to kneel or to sit down on the floor, to finish my task. When I complained to my mistress of this, she only got into a passion as usual, and said washing in hot water could not hurt anyone, that I was lazy and insolent, and wanted to be free of my work, but that she would make me do it. I thought her very hard on me, and my heart rose up within me. However, I kept still at that time, and went down again to wash the child's things. But the English washerwomen who were at work there, when they saw that I was so ill, had pity upon me and washed them for me. After that, when we came up to live in Lee Street, Mrs. Wood sorted out 5 bags of clothes which we had used at sea, and also such as had been worn since we came on shore, for me and the cook to wash. Elizabeth the cook told her, that she did not think that I was able to stand to the tub, and that she had better hire a woman. I also said myself, that I had come over to nurse the child, and that I was sorry I had come from Antigua, since mistress would work me so hard, without compassion for my rheumatism. Mr. and Mrs. Wood, when they heard this, rose up in a passion against me. They opened the door and bade me get out. But I was a stranger, and did not know one door in the street from another, and was unwilling to go away. They made a dreadful uproar, and from that day they constantly kept cursing and abusing me. I was obliged to wash, though I was very ill. Mrs. Wood, indeed, once hired a washerwoman, but she was not well treated, and would come no more. My master quarreled with me another time, about one of our great washings, his wife having stirred him up to do so. He said he would compel me to do the whole of the washing given out to me, or if I again refused, he would take a short course with me. He would either send me down to the brig in the river, to carry me back to Antigua, or he would turn me at once out of doors, and let me provide for myself. I said I would willingly go back, if he would let me purchase my own freedom. But this enraged him more than all the rest. He cursed and swore at me dreadfully, and said he would never sell my freedom. If I wished to be free, I was free in England, and I might go and try what freedom would do for me, and be d. My heart was very sore with this treatment, but I had to go on. I continued to do my work, and did all I could to give satisfaction, but all would not do. Shortly after, the cook left them, and then matters went on 10 times worse. I always washed the child's clothes without being commanded to do it, and anything else that was wanted in the family, though still I was very sick indeed. When the great washing came round, which was every 2 months, my mistress got together again a great many heavy things, such as bed ticks, bed coverlets, and for me to wash. I told her I was too ill to wash such heavy things that day. She said, she supposed I thought myself a free woman, but I was not, and if I did not do it directly I should be instantly turned out of doors. I stood a long time before I could answer, for I did not know well what to do. I knew that I was free in England, but I did not know where to go, or how to get my living, and therefore, I did not like to leave the house. But Mr. Wood said he would send for a constable to thrust me out. And at last I took courage and resolved that I would not be longer thus treated, but would go and trust to Providence. This was the 4th time they had threatened turn me out, and, go where I might, I was determined now to take them at their word. Though I thought it very hard, after I had lived with them for 13 years, and worked for them like a horse, to be driven out in this way, like a beggar. My only fault was being sick, and therefore unable to please my mistress, who thought she never could get work enough out of her slaves, and I told them so, but they only abused me and drove me out. This took place from 2 to 3 months, I think, after we came to England. When I came away, I went to the man, one Mash, who used to black the shoes of the family, and asked his wife to get somebody to go with me to Hatton Garden to the Moravian missionaries. These were the only persons I knew in England. The woman sent a young girl with me to the mission house, and I saw there a gentleman called Mr. Moore. I told him my whole story, and how my owners had treated me, and asked him to take in my trunk with what few clothes I had. The missionaries were very kind to me. They were sorry for my destitute situation, and gave me leave to bring my things to be placed under their care. They were very good people, and they told me to come to the church. When I went back to Mr. Wood's to get my trunk, I saw a lady, Mrs. Pell, who was on a visit to my mistress. When Mr. and Mrs. Wood heard me come in, they set this lady to stop me, finding that they had gone too far with me. Mrs. Pell came out to me, and said, "Are you really going to leave, Molly? Don't leave, but come into the country with me." I believe she said this because she thought Mrs. Wood would easily get me back again. I replied to her, "Ma'am, this is the 4th time my master and mistress have driven me out, or threatened to drive me, and I will give them no more occasion to bid me go." I was not willing to leave them, for I am a stranger in this country, but now I must go. I can stay no longer to be so used. Mrs. Pell then went upstairs to my mistress, and told that I would go, and that she could not stop me. Mrs. Wood was very much hurt and frightened when she found I was determined to go out that day. She said, if she goes the people will rob her, and then turn her adrift. She did not say this to me, but she spoke it loud enough for me to hear. That it might induce me not to go, I suppose. Mr. Wood also asked me where I was going to. I told him where I had been, and that I should never have gone away had I not been driven out by my owners. He had given me a written paper some time before, which said that I had come with them to England by my own desire, and that was true. It said also that I left them of my own free will, because I was a free woman in England. And that I was idle and would not do my work, which was not true. I gave this paper afterwards to a gentleman who inquired into my case. I went into the kitchen and got my clothes out. The nurse and the servant girl were there, and I said to the man who was going to take out my trunk, "Stop, before you take up this trunk, and hear what I have to say before these people. I am going out of this house, as I was ordered. But I have done no wrong at all to my owners, neither here nor in the West Indies. I always worked very hard to please them, both by night and day. But there was no giving satisfaction, for my mistress could never be satisfied with reasonable service. I told my mistress I was sick, and yet she has ordered me out of doors. This is the 4th time, and now I am going out." And so I came out, and went and carried my trunk to the Moravians. I then returned back to Mash the shoeblack's house, and begged his wife to take me in. I had a little West Indian money in my trunk, and they got it changed for me. This helped to support me for a little while. The man's wife was very kind to me. I was very sick, and she boiled nourishing things up for me. She also sent for a doctor to see me, and he sent me medicine, which did me good, though I was ill for a long time with the rheumatic pains. I lived a good many months with these poor people, and they nursed me, and did all that lay in their power to serve me. The man was well acquainted with my situation, as he used to go to and fro to Mr. Wood's house to clean shoes and knives. And he and his wife were sorry for me. About this time, a woman of the name of Hill told me of the Anti-Slavery Society, and went with me to their office, to inquire if they could do anything to get me my freedom, and send me back to the West Indies. The gentleman of the society took me to a lawyer, who examined very strictly into my case, but told me that the laws of England could do nothing to make me free in Antigua. However, they did all they could for me. They gave me a little money from time to time to keep me from want, and some of them went to Mr. Wood to try to persuade him to let me return a free woman to my husband. But though they offered him, as I have heard, a large sum for my freedom, he was sulky and obstinate, and would not consent to let me go free. This was the first winter I spent in England, and I suffered much from the severe cold, and from the rheumatic pains, which still at times torment me. However, Providence was very good to me, and I got many friends, especially some Quaker ladies, who hearing of my case, came and sought me out, and gave me good warm clothing and money. Thus I had great cause to bless God in my affliction. When I got better I was anxious to get some work to do, as I was unwilling to eat the bread of idleness. Mrs. Mash, who was a laundress, recommended me to a lady for a charwoman. She paid me very handsomely for what work I did, and I divided the money with Mrs. Mash, for though very poor, they gave me food when my own money was done, and never suffered me to want. In the spring, I got into service with a lady, who saw me at the house where I sometimes worked as a charwoman. This lady's name was Mrs. Forsyth. She had been in the West Indies, and was accustomed to blacks, and liked them. I was with her 6 months, and went with her to Margate. She treated me well, and gave me a good character when she left London. After Mrs. Forsyth went away, I was again out of place, and went to lodgings, for which I paid 2 shillings a week, and found coals and candle. After 11 weeks, the money I had saved in service was all gone, and I was forced to go back to the anti-slavery office to ask a supply, till I could get another situation. I did not like to go back, I did not like to be idle. I would rather work for my living than get it for nothing. They were very good to give me a supply, but I felt shame at being obliged to apply for relief whilst I had strength to work. At last I went into the service of Mr. and Mrs. Pringle, where I have been ever since, and am as comfortable as I can be while separated from my dear husband, and away from my own country and all old friends and connections. My dear mistress teaches me daily to read the Word of God, and takes great pains to make me understand it. I enjoy the great privilege of being enabled to attend church 3 times on the Sunday. And I have met with many kind friends since I have been here, both clergymen and others. The Reverend Mr. Young, who lives in the next house, has shown me much kindness, and taken much pains to instruct me, particularly while my master and mistress were absent in Scotland. Nor must I forget, among my friends, the Reverend Mr. Mortimer, the good clergyman of the parish, under whose ministry I have now sat for upwards of 12 months. I trust in God I have profited by what I have heard from him. He never keeps back the truth, and I think he has been the means of opening my eyes and ears much better to understand the Word of God. Mr. Mortimer tells me that he cannot open the eyes of my heart, but that I must pray to God to change my heart, and make me to know the truth, and the truth will make me free. I still live in the hope that God will find a way to give me my liberty, and give me back to my husband. I endeavor to keep down my fretting, and to leave all to him, for he knows what is good for me better than I know myself. Yet, I must confess, I find it a hard and heavy task to do so. I am often much vexed, and I feel great sorrow when I hear some people in this country say, that the slaves do not need better usage, and do not want to be free. They believe the foreign people, who deceive them, and say slaves are happy. I say, not so. How can slaves be happy when they have the halter round their neck and the whip upon their back? And are disgraced and thought no more than beasts? And are separated from their mothers, and husbands, and children, and sisters, just as cattle are sold and separated? Is it happiness for a driver in the field to take down his wife or sister or child, and strip them, and whip them in such a disgraceful manner, women that have had children exposed in the open field to shame? There is no modesty or decency shown by the owner to his slaves. Men, women, and children are exposed alike. Since I have been here I have often wondered how English people can go out into the West Indies and act in such a beastly manner. But when they go to the West Indies, they forget God and all feeling of shame, I think, since they can see and do such things. They tie up slaves like hogs, moor them up like cattle, and they lick them, so as hogs, or cattle, or horses never were flogged, and yet they come home and say, and make some good people believe, that slaves don't want to get out of slavery. But they put a cloak about the truth. It is not so. All slaves want to be free. To be free is very sweet. I will say the truth to English people who may read this history that my good friend, Miss S., is now writing down for me. I have been a slave myself, I know what slaves feel, I can tell by myself what other slaves feel, and by what they have told me. The man that says slaves be quite happy in slavery, that they don't want to be free, that man is either ignorant or a lying person. I never heard a slave say so. I never heard a Buckra man say so, till I heard tell of it in England. Such people ought to be ashamed of themselves. They can't do without slaves, they say. What's the reason they can't do without slaves as well as in England? No slaves here, no whips, no stocks, no punishment, except for wicked people. They hire servants in England, and if they don't like them, they send them away, they can't lick them. Let them work ever so hard in England, they are far better off than slaves. If they get a bad master, they give warning and go hire to another. They have their liberty. That's just what we want. We don't mind hard work, if we had proper treatment, and proper wages like English servants, and proper time given in the week to keep us from breaking the Sabbath. But they won't give it, they will have work, 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 night and day, sick or well, till we are quite done up, and we must not speak up nor look amiss, however much we be abused. And then when we are quite done up, who cares for us, more than for a lame horse? This is slavery. I tell it, to let English people know the truth. And I hope they will never leave off to pray God, and call loud to the great King of England, till all the poor blacks be given free, and slavery done up for evermore. Supplement to the History of Mary Prince by the editor. Leaving Mary's narrative, for the present, without comment to the reader's reflections, I proceed to state some circumstances connected with her case which have fallen more particularly under my own notice, and which I consider it incumbent now to lay fully before the public. About the latter end of November, 1828, this poor woman found her way to the office of the Anti-Slavery Society in Aldermanbury, by the aid of a person who had become acquainted with her situation, and had advised her to apply there for advice and assistance. After some preliminary examination into the accuracy of the circumstances related by her, I went along with her to Mr. George Stephen, solicitor, and requested him to investigate and draw up a statement of her case, and have it submitted to council, in order to ascertain whether or not, under the circumstances, her freedom could be legally established on her return to Antigua. On this occasion, in Mr. Stephen's presence and mine, she expressed, in very strong terms, her anxiety to return thither if she could go as a free person, and, at the same time, her extreme apprehensions of the fate that would probably await her if she returned as a slave. Her words were, "I would rather go into my grave than go back a slave to Antigua, though I wish to go back to my husband very much, very much, very much. I am much afraid my owners would separate me from my husband, and use me very hard, or perhaps sell me for a field negro, and slavery is too bad. I would rather go into my grave." The paper which Mr. Wood had given her before she left his house, was placed by her in Mr. Stephen's hands. It was expressed in the following terms. I have already told Molly, and now give it her in writing, in order that there may be no misunderstanding on her part, that as I brought her from Antigua at her own request and entreaty, and that she is consequently now free, she is of course at liberty to take her baggage and go where she pleases. And, in consequence of her late conduct, she must do one of two things, either quit the house, or return to Antigua by the earliest opportunity, as she does not evince a disposition to make herself useful. As she is a stranger in London, I do not wish to turn her out, or would do so, as 2 female servants are sufficient for my establishment. If after this she does remain, it will be only during her good behavior, but on no consideration will I allow her wages or any other remuneration for her services. John A. Wood. London, August 18, 1828. This paper, though not devoid of inconsistencies, which will be apparent to any attentive reader, is craftily expressed, and was well devised to serve the purpose which the writer had obviously in view, namely, to frustrate any appeal which the friendless black woman might make to the sympathy of strangers, and thus prevent her from obtaining an asylum, if she left his house, from any respectable family. As she had no one to refer to for a character in this country except himself, he doubtless calculated securely on her being speedily driven back, as soon as the slender fund she had in her possession was expended, to throw herself unconditionally upon his tender mercies. And his disappointment in this expectation appears to have exasperated his feelings of resentment towards the poor woman, to a degree which few persons alive to the claims of common justice, not to speak of Christianity or common humanity, could easily have anticipated. Such, at least, seems the only intelligible inference that can be drawn from his subsequent conduct. The case having been submitted, by desire of the Anti-Slavery Committee, to the consideration of Dr. Lushington and Mr. Sergeant Stephen, it was found that there existed no legal means of compelling Mary's master to grant her manumission, and that if she returned to Antigua, she would inevitably fall again under his power, or that of his attorneys, as a slave. It was, however, resolved to try what could be effected for her by amicable negotiation, and with this view Mr. Ravenscroft, a solicitor, Mr. Stephen's relative, called upon Mr. Wood, in order to ascertain whether he would consent to Mary's manumission on any reasonable terms, and to refer, if required, the amount of compensation for her value to arbitration. Mr. Ravenscroft with some difficulty obtained 1 or 2 interviews, but found Mr. Wood so full of animosity against the woman, and so firmly bent against any arrangement having her freedom for its object, that the negotiation was soon broken off as hopeless. The angry slave owner declared that he would not move a finger about her in this country, or grant her manumission on any terms whatever, and that if she went back to the West Indies, she must take the consequences. This unreasonable conduct of Mr. Wood induced the Anti-Slavery Committee, after several other abortive attempts to effect a compromise, to think of bringing the case under the notice of Parliament. The heads of Mary's statement were accordingly engrossed in a petition, which Dr. Lushington offered to present, and to give notice at the same time of his intention to bring in a bill to provide for the entire emancipation of all slaves brought to England with the owner's consent. But before this step was taken, Dr. Lushington again had recourse to negotiation with the master, and, partly through the friendly intervention of Mr. Manning, partly by personal conference, used every persuasion in his power to induce Mr. Wood to relent and let the bondwoman go free. Seeing the matter thus seriously taken up, Mr. Wood became at length alarmed, not relishing, it appears, the idea of having the case publicly discussed in the House of Commons. And to avert this result he submitted to temporize, assumed a demeanor of unwonted civility, and even hinted to Mr. Manning, as I was given to understand, that if he was not driven to utter hostility by the threatened exposure, he would probably meet our wishes, in his own time and way. Having gained time by these maneuvers, he adroitly endeavored to cool the ardor of Mary's new friends, in her cause, by representing her as an abandoned and worthless woman, ungrateful towards him, and undeserving of sympathy from others. Allegations which he supported by the ready affirmation of some of his West India friends, and by 1 or 2 plausible letters procured from Antigua. By these and like artifices he appears completely to have imposed on Mr. Manning, the respectable West India merchant whom Dr. Lushington had asked to negotiate with him, and he prevailed so far as to induce Dr. Lushington himself, actuated by the benevolent view of thereby best serving Mary's cause, to abstain from any remarks upon his conduct, and the petition was at last presented in Parliament. In this way he dexterously contrived to neutralize all our efforts, until the close of the session of 1829, soon after which he embarked with his family for the West Indies. Every exertion for Mary's relief having thus failed, and being fully convinced from a 12-month's observation of her conduct, that she was really a well-disposed and respectable woman, I engaged her, in December 1829, as a domestic servant in my own family. In this capacity she has remained ever since, and I am thus enabled to speak of her conduct and character with a degree of confidence I could not have otherwise done. The importance of this circumstance will appear in the sequel. From the time of Mr. Wood's departure to Antigua, in 1829, till June or July last, no farther effort was attempted for Mary's relief. Some faint hope was still cherished that this unconscionable man would at length relent, and, in his own time and way, grant the prayer of the exiled Negro woman. After waiting, however, nearly 12 months longer, and seeing the poor woman's spirits daily sinking under the sickening influence of hope deferred, I resolved on a final attempt in her behalf. Through the intervention of the Moravian missionaries, and of the governor of Antigua. At my request, Mr. Edward Moore, agent of the Moravian Brethren in London, wrote to the Reverend Joseph Newby, their missionary in that island, empowering him to negotiate in his own name with Mr. Wood for Mary's manumission, and to procure his consent, if possible, upon terms of ample pecuniary compensation. At the same time the excellent and benevolent William Allen, of the Society of Friends, wrote to Sir Patrick Ross, the governor of the colony, with whom he was on terms of friendship, soliciting him to use his influence in persuading Mr. Wood to consent, and I confess I was sanguine enough to flatter myself that we should thus at length prevail. The result proved, however, that I had not yet fully appreciated the character of the man we had to deal with. Mr. Newby's answer arrived early in November last, mentioning that he had done all in his power to accomplish our purpose, but in vain, and that if Mary's manumission could not be obtained without Mr. Wood's consent, he believed there was no prospect of its ever being effected. A few weeks afterwards I was informed by Mr. Allen that he had received a letter from Sir Patrick Ross, stating that he also had used his best endeavors in the affair, but equally without effect. Sir Patrick at the same time enclosed a letter, addressed by Mr. Wood to his secretary, Mr. Taylor, assigning his reasons for persisting in this extraordinary course. This letter requires our special attention. Its tenor is as follows. My dear Sir, in reply to your note relative to the woman Molly, I beg you will have the kindness to oblige me by assuring His Excellency that I regret exceedingly my inability to comply with his request, which under other circumstances would afford me very great pleasure. There are many and powerful reasons for inducing me to refuse my sanction to her returning here in the way she seems to wish. It would be to reward the worst species of ingratitude, and subject myself to insult whenever she came in my way. Her moral character is very bad, as the police records will shew, and she would be a very troublesome character should she come here without any restraint. She is not a native of this country, and I know of no relation she has here. I induced her to take a husband, a short time before she left this, by providing a comfortable house in my yard for them, and prohibiting her going out after 10 to 12 o'clock, our bedtime, without special leave. This she considered the greatest, and indeed the only, grievance she ever complained of, and all my efforts could not prevent it. In hopes of inducing her to be steady to her husband, who was a free man, I gave him the house to occupy during our absence, but it appears the attachment was too loose to bind her, and he has taken another wife, so on that score I do her no injury. In England she made her election, and quitted my family. This I had no right to object to. And I should have thought no more of it, but not satisfied to leave quietly, she gave every trouble and annoyance in her power, and endeavored to injure the character of my family by the most vile and infamous falsehoods, which was embodied in a petition to the House of Commons, and would have been presented, had not my friends from this island, particularly the Hon. Mr. Byam and Dr. Cole, come forward, and disproved what she had asserted. It would be beyond the limits of an ordinary letter to detail her baseness, though I will do so should His Excellency wish it. But you may judge of her depravity by one circumstance, which came out before Mr. Justice Dyett, in a quarrel with another female. Such a thing I could not have believed possible. Losing her value as a slave in a pecuniary point of view I consider of no consequence, for it was our intention, had she conducted herself properly and returned with us, to have given her freedom. She has taken her freedom. And all I wish is, that she would enjoy it without meddling with me. Let me again repeat, if His Excellency wishes it, it will afford me great pleasure to state such particulars of her, and which will be incontestably proved by numbers here. That I am sure will acquit me in his opinion of acting unkind or ungenerous towards her. I'll say nothing of the liability I should incur, under the consolidated slave law, of dealing with a free person as a slave. My only excuse for entering so much into detail must be that of my anxious wish to stand justified in His Excellency's opinion. I am, my dear sir, yours very truly, John A. Wood. October 20, 1830. Charles Taylor, Esq. And I forgot to mention that it was at her own special request that she accompanied me to England, and also that she had a considerable sum of money with her, which she had saved in my service. I knew of £36 to £40, at least, for I had some trouble to recover it from a white man, to whom she had lent it. J. A. W. Such is Mr. Wood's justification of his conduct in thus obstinately refusing manumission to the negro woman who had escaped from his house of bondage. Let us now endeavor to estimate the validity of the excuses assigned, and the allegations advanced by him, for the information of Governor Sir Patrick Ross, in this deliberate statement of his case. 1. To allow the woman to return home free, would, he affirms, be to reward the worst species of ingratitude. He assumes, it seems, the sovereign power of pronouncing a virtual sentence of banishment, for the alleged crime of ingratitude. Is this then a power which any man ought to possess over his fellow mortal? Or which any good man would ever wish to exercise? And, besides, there is no evidence whatever, beyond Mr. Wood's mere assertion, that Mary Prince owed him or his family the slightest mark of gratitude. Her account of the treatment she received in his service may be incorrect. But her simple statement is at least supported by minute and feasible details, and, unless rebutted by positive facts, will certainly command credence from impartial minds more readily than his angry accusation, which has something absurd and improbable in its very front. Moreover, is it not absurd to term the assertion of her natural rights by a slave, even supposing her to have been kindly dealt with by her owners, and treated in every respect the reverse of what Mary affirms to have been her treatment by Mr. Wood and his wife, the worst species of ingratitude? This may be West Indian ethics, but it will scarcely be received as sound doctrine in Europe. 2. To permit her return would be to subject himself to insult whenever she came in his way. This is a most extraordinary assertion. Are the laws of Antigua then so favorable to the free blacks, or the colonial police so feebly administered, that there are no sufficient restraints to protect a rich colonist like Mr. Wood, a man who counts among his familiar friends the Honorable Mr. Byam, and Mr. Taylor the government secretary, from being insulted by a poor negro woman? It is preposterous. 3. Her moral character is so bad, that she would prove very troublesome should she come to the colony without any restraint. Any restraint? Are there no restraints, supposing them necessary, short of absolute slavery to keep troublesome characters in order? But this, I suppose, is the argumentum ad gubernatorum, to frighten the governor. She is such a termagant, it seems, that if she once gets back to the colony free, she will not only make it too hot for poor Mr. Wood, but the police and courts of justice will scarce be a match for her. Sir Patrick Ross, no doubt, will take care how he intercedes farther for so formidable a virago. How can one treat such arguments seriously? 4. She is not a native of the colony, and he knows of no relation she has there. True, but was it not her home, so far as a slave can have a home, for 13 or 14 years? Were not the connections, friendships, and associations of her mature life formed there? Was it not there she hoped to spend her latter years in domestic tranquility with her husband, free from the lash of the taskmaster? These considerations may appear light to Mr. Wood, but they are everything to this poor woman. 5. He induced her, he says, to take a husband, a short time before she left Antigua, and gave them a comfortable house in his yard, and this paragraph merits attention. He induced her to take a husband? If the fact were true, what brutality of mind and manners does it not indicate among these slaveholders? They refuse to legalize the marriages of their slaves, but induce them to form such temporary connections as may suit the owner's conveniency, just as they would pair the lower animals, and this man has the effrontery to tell us so. Mary, however, tells a very different story. See page 17, winky face, and her assertion, independently of other proof, is at least as credible as Mr. Wood's. The reader will judge for himself as to the preponderance of internal evidence in the conflicting statements. 6. He alleges that she was, before marriage, licentious, and even depraved in her conduct, and unfaithful to her husband afterwards. These are serious charges. But if true, or even partially true, how comes it that a person so correct in his family hours and arrangements as Mr. Wood professes to be, and who expresses so edifying a horror of licentiousness, could reconcile it to his conscience to keep in the bosom of his family so depraved, as well as so troublesome a character for at least 13 years? And confide to her for long periods too the charge of his house and the care of his children, for such I shall shew to have been the facts. How can he account for not having rid himself with all speed, of so disreputable an inmate, he who values her loss so little, in a pecuniary point of view? How can he account for having sold 5 other slaves in that period, and yet have retained this shocking woman, nay, even have refused to sell her, on more than one occasion, when offered her full value? It could not be from ignorance of her character, for the circumstance which he adduces as a proof of her shameless depravity, and which I have omitted on account of its indecency, occurred, it would appear, not less than 10 years ago. Yet, notwithstanding her alleged ill qualities and habits of gross immorality, he has not only constantly refused to part with her, but after 13 long years, brings her to England as an attendant on his wife and children, with the avowed intention of carrying her back along with his maiden daughter, a young lady returning from school. Such are the extraordinary facts. And until Mr. Wood shall reconcile these singular inconsistencies between his actions and his allegations, he must not be surprised if we in England prefer giving credit to the former rather than the latter. Although at present it appears somewhat difficult to say which side of the alternative is the more creditable to his own character. 7. Her husband, he says, has taken another wife, so that on that score, he adds, he does her no injury. Supposing this fact be true, which I doubt, as I doubt every mere assertion from so questionable a quarter, I shall take leave to put a question or two to Mr. Wood's conscience. Did he not write from England to his friend Mr. Darrell, soon after Mary left his house, directing him to turn her husband, Daniel James, off his premises, on account of her offense? Telling him to inform James at the same time that his wife had taken up with another man, who had robbed her of all she had, a calumny as groundless as it was cruel? I further ask if the person who invented this story, whoever he may be, was not likely enough to impose similar fabrications on the poor Negro man's credulity, until he may have been induced to prove false to his marriage vows, and to take another wife, as Mr. Wood coolly expresses it. But withal, I strongly doubt the fact of Daniel James' infidelity, for there is now before me a letter from himself to Mary, dated in April 1830, couched in strong terms of conjugal affection, expressing his anxiety for her speedy return, and stating that he had lately received a grace, a token of religious advancement, in the Moravian Church, a circumstance altogether incredible if the man were living in open adultery, as Mr. Wood's assertion implies. 8. Mary, he says, endeavored to injure the character of his family by infamous falsehoods, which were embodied in a petition to the House of Commons, and would have been presented, had not his friends from Antigua, the Honorable Mr. Byam, and Dr. Cole, disproved her assertions. I can say something on this point from my own knowledge. Mary's petition contained simply a brief statement of her case, and, among other things, mentioned the treatment she had received from Mr. and Mrs. Wood. Now the principal facts are corroborated by other evidence, and Mr. Wood must bring forward very different testimony from that of Dr. Cole before well-informed persons will give credit to his contradiction. The value of that person's evidence in such cases will be noticed presently. Of the Honorable Mr. Byam I know nothing, and shall only at present remark that it is not likely to redound greatly to his credit to appear in such company. Furthermore, Mary's petition was presented, as Mr. Wood ought to know, though it was not discussed, nor his conduct exposed as it ought to have been. 9. He speaks of the liability he should incur, under the consolidated slave law, of dealing with a free person as a slave. Is not this pretext hypocritical in the extreme? What liability could he possibly incur by voluntarily resigning the power, conferred on him by an iniquitous colonial law, of reimposing the shackles of slavery on the bondwoman from whose limbs they had fallen when she touched the free soil of England? There exists no liability from which he might not have been easily secured, or for which he would not have been fully compensated. He adds in a postscript that Mary had a considerable sum of money with her, from £36 to £40 at least, which she had saved in his service. The fact is, that she had at one time $113 in cash. But only a very small portion of that sum appears to have been brought by her to England, the rest having been partly advanced, as she states, to assist her husband, and partly lost by being lodged in unfaithful custody. Finally, Mr. Wood repeats twice that it will afford him great pleasure to state for the governor's satisfaction, if required, such particulars of the woman Molly, upon incontestable evidence, as he is sure will acquit him in his Excellency's opinion, of acting unkind or ungenerous towards her. This is well, and I now call upon Mr. Wood to redeem his pledge, to bring forward facts and proofs fully to elucidate the subject, to reconcile, if he can, the extraordinary discrepancies which I have pointed out between his assertions and the actual facts, and especially between his account of Mary Prince's character and his own conduct in regard to her. He has now to produce such a statement as will acquit him not only in the opinion of Sir Patrick Ross, but of the British public. And in this position he has spontaneously placed himself, in attempting to destroy, by his deliberate criminatory letter, the poor woman's fair fame and reputation, an attempt but for which the present publication would probably never have appeared. Here perhaps we might safely leave the case to the judgment of the public. But as this Negro woman's character, not the less valuable to her because her condition is so humble, has been so unscrupulously blackened by her late master, a party so much interested and inclined to place her in the worst point of view, it is incumbent on me, as her advocate with the public, to state such additional testimony in her behalf as I can fairly and conscientiously adduce. My first evidence is Mr. Joseph Phillips, of Antigua. Having submitted to his inspection Mr. Wood's letter and Mary Prince's narrative, and requested his candid and deliberate sentiments in regard to the actual facts of the case, I have been favored with the following letter from him on the subject. London, January 18, 1831. Dear Sir, in giving you my opinion of Mary Prince's narrative, and of Mr. Wood's letter respecting her, addressed to Mr. Taylor, I shall first mention my opportunities of forming a proper estimate of the conduct and character of both parties. I have known Mr. Wood since his first arrival in Antigua in 1803. He was then a poor young man, who had been brought up as a ship carpenter in Bermuda. He was afterwards raised to be a clerk in the commissariat department, and realized sufficient capital to commence business as a merchant. This last profession he has followed successfully for a good many years, and is understood to have accumulated very considerable wealth. After he entered into trade, I had constant intercourse with him in the way of business. And in 1824 and 1825, I was regularly employed on his premises as his clerk. Consequently, I had opportunities of seeing a good deal of his character both as a merchant, and as a master of slaves. The former topic I pass over as irrelevant to the present subject. In reference to the latter, I shall merely observe that he was not, in regard to ordinary matters, more severe than the ordinary run of slave owners. But, if seriously offended, he was not of a disposition to be easily appeased, and would spare no cost or sacrifice to gratify his vindictive feelings. As regards the exaction of work from domestic slaves, his wife was probably more severe than himself. It was almost impossible for the slaves ever to give her entire satisfaction. Of their slave Molly, or Mary, I know less than of Mr. and Mrs. Wood. But I saw and heard enough of her, both while I was constantly employed on Mr. Wood's premises, and while I was there occasionally on business, to be quite certain that she was viewed by her owners as their most respectable and trustworthy female slave. It is within my personal knowledge that she had usually the charge of the house in their absence, was entrusted with the keys, and was always considered by the neighbors and visitors as their confidential household servant, and as a person in whose integrity they placed unlimited confidence, although when Mrs. Wood was at home, she was no doubt kept pretty closely at washing and other hard work. A decided proof of the estimation in which she was held by her owners exists in the fact that Mr. would uniformly refuse to part with her, whereas he sold 5 other slaves while she was with them. Indeed, she always appeared to me to be a slave of superior intelligence and respectability. And I always understood such to be her general character in the place. As to what Mr. Wood alleges about her being frequently before the police, I can only say I never heard of the circumstance before. And as I lived for 20 years in the same small town, and in the vicinity of their residence, I think I could scarcely have failed to become acquainted with it, had such been the fact. She might, however, have been occasionally before the magistrate in consequence of little disputes among the slaves, without any serious imputation on her general respectability. She says she was twice summoned to appear as a witness on such occasions, and that she was once sent by her mistress to be confined in the cage, and was afterwards flogged by her desire. This cruel practice is very common in Antigua, and, in my opinion, is but little creditable to the slave owners and magistrates by whom such arbitrary punishments are inflicted, frequently for very trifling faults. Mr. James Scotland is the only magistrate in the colony who invariably refuses to sanction this reprehensible practice. Of the immoral conduct ascribed to Molly by Mr. Wood, I can say nothing further than this, that I have heard she had at a former period, previous to her marriage, a connection with a white person, a captain, which I have no doubt was broken off when she became seriously impressed with religion. But, at any rate, such connections are so common, I might almost say universal, in our slave colonies, that except by the missionaries and a few serious persons, they are considered, if faults at all, so very venial as scarcely to deserve the name of immorality. Mr. Wood knows this colonial estimate of such connections as well as I do. And, however false such an estimate must be allowed to be, especially when applied to their own conduct by persons of education, pretending to adhere to the pure Christian rule of morals, yet when he ascribes to a Negro slave, to whom legal marriage was denied, such great criminality for laxity of this sort, and professes to be so exceedingly shocked and amazed at the tale he himself relates, he must, I am confident, have had a farther object in view than the information of Mr. Taylor or Sir Patrick Ross. He must, it is evident, have been aware that his letter would be sent to Mr. Allen, and accordingly adapted it, as more important documents from the colonies are often adapted, for effect in England. The tale of the slave Molly's immoralities, be assured, was not intended for Antigua so much as for Stoke Newington, and Peckham, and Aldermanbury. In regard to Mary's narrative generally, although I cannot speak to the accuracy of the details, except in a few recent particulars, I can with safety declare that I see no reason to question the truth of a single fact stated by her, or even to suspect her in any instance of intentional exaggeration. It bears in my judgment the genuine stamp of truth and nature. Such is my unhesitating opinion, after a residence of 27 years in the West Indies. I remain, and Joseph Phillips. To T. Pringle, Esq. P.S. As Mr. Wood refers to the evidence of Dr. T. Cole in opposition to Mary's assertions, it may be proper to enable you justly to estimate the worth of that person's evidence in cases connected with the condition and treatment of slaves. You are aware that in 1829, Mr. Queen of Glasgow, in noticing a report of the Ladies' Society of Birmingham for the relief of British Negro slaves, asserted with his characteristic audacity that the statement which it contained respecting distressed and deserted slaves in Antigua was an abominable falsehood. Not contented with this, and with insinuating that I, as agent of the society in the distribution of their charity in Antigua, had fraudulently duped them out of their money by a fabricated tale of distress, Mr. Queen proceeded to libel me in the most opprobrious terms, as a man of the most worthless and abandoned character. Now I know from good authority that it was upon Dr. Cole's information that Mr. Queen founded this impudent contradiction of notorious facts, and this audacious libel of my personal character. From this single circumstance you may judge of the value of his evidence in the case of Mary Prince. I can furnish further information respecting Dr. Cole's colonial proceedings, both private and judicial, should circumstances require it. J. P. I leave the preceding letter to be candidly weighed by the reader in opposition to the inculpatory allegations of Mr. Wood, merely remarking that Mr. Wood will find it somewhat difficult to impugn the evidence of Mr. Phillips, whose upright, unimpeached, and unexceptionable character he has himself vouched for in unqualified terms, by affixing his signature to the testimonial published in the Weekly Register of Antigua in 1825. See note below. The next testimony in Mary's behalf is that of Mrs. Forsyth, a lady in whose service she spent the summer of 1829, see page 21. This lady, on leaving London to join her husband, voluntarily presented Mary with a certificate, which, though it relates only to a recent and short period of her history, is a strong corroboration of the habitual respectability of her character. It is in the following terms. Mrs. Forsyth states that the bearer of this paper, Mary James, has been with her for the last 6 months, that she has found her an excellent character, being honest, industrious, and sober. And that she parts with her on no other account than this, that being obliged to travel with her husband, who has lately come from abroad in bad health, she has no farther need of a servant. Any person wishing to engage her, can have her character in full from Miss Robson, 4 Keppel Street, Russell Square, whom Mrs. Forsyth has requested to furnish particulars to any one desiring them. 4 Keppel Street, September 28, 1829. In the last place, I add my own testimony in behalf of this Negro woman. Independently of the scrutiny, which, as Secretary of the Anti-Slavery Society, I made into her case when she first applied for assistance, at 18, Aldermanbury, and the watchful eye I kept upon her conduct for the ensuing 12 months. While she was the occasional pensioner of the Society, I have now had the opportunity of closely observing her conduct for 14 months, in the situation of a domestic servant in my own family. And the following is the deliberate opinion of Mary's character, formed not only by myself, but also by my wife and sister-in-law, after this ample period of observation. We have found her perfectly honest and trustworthy in all respects, so that we have no hesitation in leaving everything in the house at her disposal. She had the entire charge of the house during our absence in Scotland for 3 months last autumn, and conducted herself in that charge with the utmost discretion and fidelity. She is not, it is true, a very expert housemaid, nor capable of much hard work, for her constitution appears to be a good deal broken, but she is careful, industrious, and anxious to do her duty and to give satisfaction. She is capable of strong attachments, and feels deep, though unobtrusive, gratitude for real kindness shown her. She possesses considerable natural sense, and has much quickness of observation and discrimination of character. She is remarkable for decency and propriety of conduct, and her delicacy, even in trifling minutiae, has been a trait of special remark by the females of my family. This trait, which is obviously quite unaffected, would be a most inexplicable anomaly, if her former habits had been so indecent and depraved as Mr. Wood alleges. Her chief faults, so far as we have discovered them, are a somewhat violent and hasty temper, and a considerable share of natural pride and self-importance. But these defects have been but rarely and transiently manifested, and have scarcely occasioned an hour's uneasiness at any time in our household. Her religious knowledge, notwithstanding the pious care of her Moravian instructors in Antigua, is still but very limited, and her views of Christianity indistinct. But her profession, whatever it may have of imperfection, I am convinced, has nothing of insincerity. In short, we consider her on the whole as respectable and well-behaved a person in her station, as any domestic, white or black, and we have had ample experience of both colors, that we have ever had in our service. But after all, Mary's character, important though its exculpation be to her, is not really the point of chief practical interest in this case. Suppose all Mr. Wood's defamatory allegations to be true, suppose him to be able to rake up against her out of the records of the Antigua police, or from the veracious testimony of his brother colonists. 20 stories as bad or worse than what he insinuates, suppose the whole of her own statement to be false, and even the whole of her conduct since she came under our observation here to be a tissue of hypocrisy. Suppose all this, and leave the Negro woman as black in character as in complexion, yet it would affect not the main facts, which are these. 1. Mr. Wood, not daring in England to punish this woman arbitrarily, as he would have done in the West Indies, drove her out of his house, or left her, at least, only the alternative of returning instantly to Antigua. With the certainty of severe treatment there, or submitting in silence to what she considered intolerable usage in his household. 2. He has since obstinately persisted in refusing her manumission, to enable her to return home in security, though repeatedly offered more than ample compensation for her value as a slave. And this on various frivolous pretexts, but really, and indeed not unavowedly, in order to punish her for leaving his service in England, though he himself had professed to give her that option. These unquestionable facts speak volumes. The case affords a most instructive illustration of the true spirit of the slave system, and of the pretensions of the slaveholders to assert, not merely their claims to a vested right in the labor of their bondmen, but to an indefeasible property in them as their absolute chattels. It furnishes a striking practical comment on the assertions of the West Indians that self-interest is a sufficient check to the indulgence of vindictive feelings in the master. For here is a case where a man, a respectable and benevolent man as his friends aver, prefers losing entirely the full price of the slave, for the mere satisfaction of preventing a poor black woman from returning home to her husband. If the pleasure of thwarting the benevolent wishes of the anti-slavery society in behalf of the deserted Negro be an additional motive with Mr. Wood, it will not much mend his wretched plea. I may here add a few words respecting the earlier portion of Mary Prince's narrative. The facts there stated must necessarily rest entirely, since we have no collateral evidence, upon their intrinsic claims to probability, and upon the reliance the reader may feel disposed, after perusing the foregoing pages, to place on her veracity. To my judgment, the internal evidence of the truth of her narrative appears remarkably strong. The circumstances are related in a tone of natural sincerity, and are accompanied in almost every case with characteristic and minute details, which must, I conceive, carry with them full conviction to every candid mind that this Negro woman has actually seen, felt, and suffered all that she so impressively describes, and that the picture she has given of West Indian slavery is not less true than it is revolting. But there may be some persons into whose hands this tract may fall, so imperfectly acquainted with the real character of Negro slavery, as to be shocked into partial, if not absolute incredulity, by the acts of inhuman oppression and brutality related of Captain I, and his wife, and of Mr. D, the salt manufacturer of Turk's Island. Here, at least, such persons may be disposed to think, there surely must be some exaggeration, the facts are too shocking to be credible. The facts are indeed shocking, but unhappily not the less credible on that account. Slavery is a curse to the oppressor scarcely less than to the oppressed. Its natural tendency is to brutalize both. After a residence myself of 6 years in a slave colony, I am inclined to doubt whether, as regards its demoralizing influence, the master is not even a greater object of compassion than his bondman. Let those who are disposed to doubt the atrocities related in this narrative, on the testimony of a sufferer, examine the details of many cases of similar barbarity that have lately come before the public, on unquestionable evidence. Passing over the reports of the Fiscal of Burbus, and the Mauritius horrors recently unveiled, let them consider the case of Mr. and Mrs. Moss, of the Bahamas, and their slave Kate, so justly denounced by the Secretary for the Colonies. The cases of Eleanor Meade, of Henry Williams, and of the Reverend Mr. Bridges and Kitty Hilton, in Jamaica. These cases alone might suffice to demonstrate the inevitable tendency of slavery as it exists in our colonies, to brutalize the master to a truly frightful degree, a degree which would often cast into the shade even the atrocities related in the narrative of Mary Prince, and which are sufficient to prove, independently of all other evidence, that there is nothing in the revolting character of the facts to affect their credibility, but that on the contrary, similar deeds are at this very time of frequent occurrence in almost every one of our slave colonies. The system of coercive labor may vary in different places. It may be more destructive to human life in the cane culture of Mauritius and Jamaica, than in the predial and domestic bondage of Bermuda or the Bahamas, but the spirit and character of slavery are everywhere the same, and cannot fail to produce similar effects. Wherever slavery prevails, there will inevitably be found cruelty and oppression. Individuals who have preserved humane, and amiable, and tolerant dispositions towards their black dependents, may doubtless be found among slaveholders. But even where a happy instance of this sort occurs, such as Mary's first mistress, the kind-hearted Mrs. Williams, the favored condition of the slave is still as precarious as it is rare, it is every moment at the mercy of events, and must always be held by a tenure so proverbially uncertain as that of human prosperity, or human life. Such examples, like a feeble and flickering streak of light in a gloomy picture, only serve by contrast to exhibit the depth of the prevailing shades. Like other exceptions, they only prove the general rule. The unquestionable tendency of the system is to vitiate the best tempers, and to harden the most feeling hearts. "Never be kind, nor speak kindly to a slave," said an accomplished English lady in South Africa to my wife. "I have now," she added, "been for some time a slave owner, and have found, from vexatious experience in my own household, that nothing but harshness and hauteur will do with slaves." I might perhaps not inappropriately illustrate this point more fully by stating many cases which fell under my own personal observation, or became known to me through authentic sources, at the Cape of Good Hope, a colony where slavery assumes, as it is averred, a milder aspect than in any other dependency of the empire where it exists. And I could shew, from the judicial records of that colony, received by me within these few weeks, cases scarcely inferior in barbarity to the worst of those to which I have just specially referred. But to do so would lead me too far from the immediate purpose of this pamphlet, and extend it to an inconvenient length. I shall therefore content myself with quoting a single short passage from the excellent work of my friend Dr. Walsh, entitled Notices of Brazil, a work which, besides its other merits, has vividly illustrated the true spirit of Negro slavery, as it displays itself not merely in that country, but wherever it has been permitted to open its Pandora's box of misery and crime. Let the reader ponder on the following just remarks, and compare the facts stated by the author in illustration of them with the circumstances related at pages 6 and 7 of Mary's narrative. If then we put out of the question the injury inflicted on others, and merely consider the deterioration of feeling and principle with which it operates on ourselves, ought it not to be a sufficient, and, indeed, unanswerable argument, against the permission of slavery? The exemplary manner in which the paternal duties are performed at home may mark people as the most fond and affectionate parents. But let them once go abroad, and come within the contagion of slavery, and it seems to alter the very nature of a man. And the father has sold, and still sells, the mother and his children, with as little compunction as he would a sow and her litter of pigs, and he often disposes of them together. This deterioration of feeling is conspicuous in many ways among the Brazilians. They are naturally a people of a humane and good-natured disposition, and much indisposed to cruelty or severity of any kind. Indeed, the manner in which many of them treat their slaves is a proof of this, as it is really gentle and considerate. But the natural tendency to cruelty and oppression in the human heart is continually evolved by the impunity and uncontrolled license in which they are exercised. I never walked through the streets of Rio, that some house did not present to me the semblance of a bridewell, where the moans and the cries of the sufferers, and the sounds of whips and scourges within, announced to me that corporal punishment was being inflicted. Whenever I remarked this to a friend, I was always answered that the refractory nature of the slave rendered it necessary, and no house could properly be conducted unless it was practiced. But this is certainly not the case. And the chastisement is constantly applied in the very wantonness of barbarity, and would not, and dared not, be inflicted on the humblest wretch in society, if he was not a slave, and so put out of the pale of pity. Immediately joining our house was one occupied by a mechanic, from which the most dismal cries and moans constantly proceeded. I entered the shop one day, and found it was occupied by a saddler, who had 2 Negro boys working at his business. He was a tawny, cadaverous-looking man, with a dark aspect, and he had cut from his leather a scourge like a Russian knout, which he held in his hand, and was in the act of exercising on one of the naked children in an inner room, and this was the cause of the moans and cries we heard every day, and almost all day long. In the rear of our house was another, occupied by some women of bad character, who kept, as usual, several Negro slaves. I was awoke early one morning by dismal cries, and looking out of the window, I saw in the backyard of the house, a black girl of about 14 years old. Before her stood her mistress, a white woman, with a large stick in her hand. She was undressed except her petticoat and chemise, which had fallen down and left her shoulders and bosom bare. Her hair was streaming behind, and every fierce and malevolent passion was depicted in her face. She too, like my hostess at Governo, another striking illustration of the dehumanizing effects of slavery, was the very representation of a fury. She was striking the poor girl, whom she had driven up into a corner, where she was on her knees appealing for mercy. She shewed her none, but continued to strike her on the head and thrust the stick into her face, till she was herself exhausted, and her poor victim covered with blood. This scene was renewed every morning, and the cries and moans of the poor suffering blacks announced that they were enduring the penalty of slavery. In being the objects on which the irritable and malevolent passions of the whites are allowed to vent themselves with impunity. Nor could I help deeply deploring that state of society in which the vilest characters in the community are allowed an almost uncontrolled power of life and death over their innocent and far more estimable fellow creatures. Notices of Brazil, Volume 2. Pages 354 to 356. In conclusion, I may observe that the history of Mary Prince furnishes a corollary to Lord Stowell's decision in the case of the slave Grace, and that it is most valuable on this account. Whatever opinions may be held by some readers on the grave question of immediately abolishing colonial slavery, nothing assuredly can be more repugnant to the feelings of Englishmen than that the system should be permitted to extend its baneful influence to this country. Yet such is the case, when the slave landed in England still only possesses that qualified degree of freedom, that a change of domicile will determine it. Though born a British subject, and resident within the shores of England, he is cut off from his dearest natural rights by the sad alternative of regaining them at the expense of liberty, and the certainty of severe treatment. It is true that he has the option of returning. But it is a cruel mockery to call it a voluntary choice, when upon his return depend his means of subsistence and his reunion with all that makes life valuable. Here he has tasted the sweets of freedom, to quote the words of the unfortunate Mary Prince. But if he desires to restore himself to his family, or to escape from suffering and destitution, and the other evils of a climate uncongenial to his constitution and habits, he must abandon the enjoyment of his late acquired liberty, and again subject himself to the arbitrary power of a vindictive master. The case of Mary Prince is by no means a singular one, many of the same kind are daily occurring, and even if the case were singular, it would still loudly call for the interference of the legislature. In instances of this kind no injury can possibly be done to the owner by confirming to the slave his resumption of his natural rights. It is the master's spontaneous act to bring him to this country. He knows when he brings him that he divests himself of his property. And it is, in fact, a minor species of slave trading, when he has thus enfranchised his slave, to recapture that slave by the necessities of his condition, or by working upon the better feelings of his heart. Abstractedly from all legal technicalities, there is no real difference between thus compelling the return of the enfranchised Negro, and trepanning a free native of England by delusive hopes into perpetual slavery. The most ingenious casuist could not point out any essential distinction between the two cases. Our boasted liberty is the dream of imagination, and no longer the characteristic of our country, if its bulwarks can thus be thrown down by colonial special pleading. It would well become the character of the present government to introduce a bill into the legislature making perpetual that freedom which the slave has acquired by his passage here, and thus to declare, in the most ample sense of the words, what indeed we had long fondly believed to be the fact, though it now appears that we have been mistaken, that no slave can exist within the shores of Great Britain. Footnotes. Bermuda currency, about £38 sterling. Let the reader compare the above affecting account, taken down from the mouth of this Negro woman, with the following description of a vendue of slaves at the Cape of Good Hope, published by me in 1826, from the letter of a friend. And mark their similarity in several characteristic circumstances. The resemblance is easily accounted for. Slavery wherever it prevails produces similar effects to, having heard that there was to be a sale of cattle, farm stock, and by auction, at a Velcornitz in the vicinity, we halted our wagon one day for the purpose of procuring a fresh span of oxen. Among the stock of the farms sold, was a female slave and her 3 children. The 2 eldest children were girls, the one about 13 years of age, and the other about 11, the youngest was a boy. The whole family were exhibited together, but they were sold separately, and to different purchasers. The farmers examined them as if they had been so many head of cattle. While the sale was going on, the mother and her children were exhibited on a table, that they might be seen by the company, which was very large. There could not have been a finer subject for an able painter than this unhappy group. The tears, the anxiety, the anguish of the mother, while she met the gaze of the multitude, eyed the different countenances of the bidders, or cast a heart-rending look upon the children. And the simplicity and touching sorrow of the young ones, while they clung to their distracted parent, wiping their eyes, and half concealing their faces. Contrasted with the marked insensibility and jocular countenances of the spectators and purchasers, furnished a striking commentary on the miseries of slavery, and its debasing effects upon the hearts of its abettors. While the woman was in this distressed situation, she was asked, "Can you feed sheep?" Her reply was so indistinct that it escaped me. But it was probably in the negative, for her purchaser rejoined, in a loud and harsh voice, "Then I will teach you with the sjambok, a whip made of the rhinoceros hide." The mother and her 3 children were sold to 3 separate purchasers. And they were literally torn from each other. Ed. These strong expressions, and all of a similar character in this little narrative, are given verbatim as uttered by Mary Prince. Ed. The cattle on a small plantation in Bermuda are, it seems, often thus staked or tethered, both night and day, in situations where grass abounds. A cow fed for slaughter. A thong of hard twisted hide, known by this name in the West Indies. Of the subsequent lot of her relatives she can tell but little. She says, her father died while she and her mother were at Turk's Island. And that he had been long dead and buried before any of his children in Bermuda knew of it, they being slaves on other estates. Her mother died after Mary went to Antigua. Of the fate of the rest of her kindred, 7 brothers and 3 sisters, she knows nothing further than this, that the eldest sister, who had several children to her master, was taken by him to Trinidad. And that the youngest, Rebecca, is still alive, and in slavery in Bermuda. Mary herself is now about 43 years of age. Ed. Negro term for white people. About 67 pounds. 10s sterling. A dog is the 72nd part of a dollar. The head Negro of an estate, a person who has the chief superintendence under the manager. She possesses a copy of Mrs. Trimmer's Charity School Spelling Book, presented to her by the Reverend Mr. Curtin, and dated August 30, 1817. In this book her name is written Mary, Princess of Wales, an appellation which, she says, was given her by her owners. It is a common practice with the colonists to give ridiculous names of this description to their slaves. Being, in fact, one of the numberless modes of expressing the habitual contempt with which they regard the Negro race. In printing this narrative we have retained Mary's paternal name of Prince. Ed. See page. She came first to the anti-slavery office in Aldermanbury, about the latter end of November 1828, and her case was referred to Mr. George Stephen to be investigated. More of this hereafter. Ed. She refers to a written certificate which will be inserted afterwards. The whole of this paragraph especially, is given as nearly as was possible in Mary's precise words. She means West Indians. A West Indian phrase, to fasten or tie up. I omit the circumstance here mentioned, because it is too indecent to appear in a publication likely to be perused by females. It is, in all probability, a vile calumny, but even if it were perfectly true, it would not serve Mr. Wood's case one straw. Any reader who wishes it, may see the passage referred to, in the autograph letter in my possession. T.P. In elucidation of the circumstances above referred to, I subjoin the following extracts from the report of the Birmingham Ladies' Society for 1830. As a portion of the funds of this association has been appropriated to assist the benevolent efforts of a society which has for 15 years afforded relief to distressed and deserted slaves in Antigua. It may not be uninteresting to our friends to learn the manner in which the agent of this society has been treated for simply obeying the command of our Savior, by ministering, like the Good Samaritan, to the distresses of the helpless and the desolate. The Society's proceedings being adverted to by a friend of Africa, at one of the public meetings held in this country, a West Indian planter, who was present, rode over to his friends in Antigua, and represented the conduct of the distributors of this charity in such a light, that it was deemed worthy of the cognizance of the House of Assembly. Mr. Joseph Phillips, a resident of the island, who had most kindly and disinterestedly exerted himself in the distribution of the money from England among the poor deserted slaves, was brought before the Assembly and most severely interrogated. On his refusing to deliver up his private correspondence with his friends in England, he was thrown into a loathsome jail, where he was kept for nearly 5 months. While his loss of business, and the oppressive proceedings instituted against him, were involving him in poverty and ruin. On his discharge by the House of Assembly, he was seized in their lobby for debt, and again imprisoned. In our report for the year 1826, we quoted a passage from the 13th Report of the Society for the Relief of Deserted Slaves in the island of Antigua, in reference to a case of great distress. This statement fell into the hands of Mr. Queen, the editor of the Glasgow Courier. Of the consequences resulting from this circumstance we only gained information through the Leicester Chronicle, which had copied an article from the Weekly Register of Antigua, dated St. John's, September 22, 1829. We find from this that Mr. Queen affirms that, with the exception of the fact that the society is, as it deserves to be, duped out of its money, the whole tale, of the distress above referred to, is an abominable falsehood. This statement, which we are informed has appeared in many of the public papers, is completely refuted in our appendix, number 4, to which we refer our readers. Mr. Queen's statements, we regret to say, would lead many to believe that there are no deserted Negroes to assist, and that the case mentioned was a perfect fabrication. He also distinctly avers that the disinterested and humane agent of the society, Mr. Joseph Phillips, is a man of the most worthless and abandoned character. In opposition to this statement, we learn the good character of Mr. Phillips from those who have long been acquainted with his laudable exertions in the cause of humanity, and from the editor of the Weekly Register of Antigua, who speaks, on his own knowledge, of more than 20 years back, confidently appealing at the same time to the inhabitants of the colony in which he resides for the truth of his averments, and producing a testimonial to Mr. Phillips's good character signed by 2 members of the Antigua House of Assembly, and by Mr. Wyke, the collector of His Majesty's customs, and by Antigua merchants, as follows, that they have been acquainted with him the last 4 years and upwards. And he has always conducted himself in an upright becoming manner, his character we know to be unimpeached, and his morals unexceptionable. Signed, Thomas Saunderson John D. Taylor. John A. Wood George Wyke. Samuel L. Darrell Giles S. Musson. Robert Grant. St. John's, Antigua, June 28, 1825. In addition to the above testimonies, Mr. Phillips has brought over to England with him others of a more recent date, from some of the most respectable persons in Antigua, sufficient to cover with confusion all his unprincipled calumniators. See also his account of his own case in the Anti-Slavery Reporter, number 74, page 69. If it even were so, how strong a plea of palliation might not the poor Negro bring, by adducing the neglect of her various owners to afford religious instruction or moral discipline, and the habitual influence of their evil example, to say the very least, before her eyes? What moral good could she possibly learn, what moral evil could she easily escape, while under the uncontrolled power of such masters as she describes Captain I, and Mr. D, of Turk's Island? All things considered, it is indeed wonderful to find her such as she now is. But as she has herself piously expressed it, that God whom then she knew not mercifully preserved her for better things. Since the preceding pages were printed off, I have been favored with a communication from the Reverend J. Curtin, to whom among other acquaintances of Mr. Woods in this country, the entire proof sheets of this pamphlet had been sent for inspection. Mr. Curtin corrects some omissions and inaccuracies in Mary Prince's narrative, see page 17, by stating, 1. That she was baptized, not in August, but on the 6th of April 1817, 2. That sometime before her baptism, on her being admitted a catechumen, preparatory to that holy ordinance, she brought a note from her owner, Mr. Wood, recommending her for religious instruction, and 3. That it was his usual practice, when any adult slaves came on weekdays to school, to require their owner's permission for their attendance, but that on Sundays the chapel was open indiscriminately to all. Mary, after a personal interview with Mr. Curtin, and after hearing his letter read by me, still maintains that Mr. Wood's note recommended her for baptism merely, and that she never received any religious instruction whatever from Mr. and Mrs. Wood, or from anyone else at that period beyond what she has stated in her narrative. In regard to her non-admission to the Sunday school without permission from her owners, she admits that she may possibly have mistaken the clergyman's meaning on that point, but says that such was certainly her impression at the time. And the actual cause of her non-attendance. Mr. Curtin finds in his book some reference to Mary's connection with a captain, the individual, I believe, alluded to by Mr. Phillips at page 32. But he states that when she attended his chapel she was always decently and becomingly dressed, and appeared to him to be in a situation of trust in her mistress's family d'amour. Curtin offers no comment on any other part of Mary's statement. But he speaks in very favorable, though general terms of the respectability of Mr. Wood, whom he had known for many years in Antigua, and of Mrs. Wood, though she was not personally known to him. He says that he had heard her spoken of by those of her acquaintance, as a lady of very mild and amiable manners. Another friend of Mr. and Mrs. Wood, a lady who had been their guest both in Antigua and England, alleges that Mary has grossly misrepresented them in her narrative, and says that she can vouch for their being the most benevolent, kind-hearted people that can possibly live. She has declined, however, to furnish me with any written correction of the misrepresentations she complains of, although I offered to insert her testimony in behalf of her friends, if sent to me in time. And having already kept back the publication a fortnight waiting for communications of this sort, I will not delay it longer. Those who have withheld their strictures have only themselves to blame. Out of the general character of Mr. and Mrs. Wood, I would not designedly give any unfair impression. Without implicitly adopting either the ex parte view of Mary Prince, or the unmeasured encomiums of their friends, I am willing to believe them to be, on the whole, fair, perhaps favorable, specimens of colonial character. Let them even be rated, if you will, in the very highest and most benevolent class of slaveholders, and, laying everything else entirely out of view, let Mr. Wood's conduct in this affair be tried exclusively by the facts established beyond dispute, and by his own statement of the case in his letter to Mr. Taylor. But then, I ask, if the very best and mildest of your slave owners can act as Mr. Wood is proved to have acted, what is to be expected of persons whose mildness, or equity, or common humanity no one will dare to vouch for? If such things are done in the green tree, what will be done in the dry? And what else then can colonial slavery possibly be, even in its best estate, but a system incurably evil and iniquitous? I require no other data, I need add no further comment. See Anti-Slavery Reporter, Numbers 5 and 16. Ibid, number 44. Ibid, number 47. Ibid, number 64, page 345, number 71, page 481. Ibid, number 65, page 356, number 69, page 431. Anti-Slavery Reporter, numbers 66, 69, and 76. Narrative of Louis Asa, a captured African. The following interesting narrative is a convenient supplement to the history of Mary Prince. It is given, like hers, as nearly as possible in the narrator's words, with only so much correction as was necessary to connect the story, and render it grammatical. The concluding passage in inverted commas is entirely his own. While Mary's narrative shews the disgusting character of colonial slavery, this little tale explains with equal force the horrors in which it originates. It is necessary to explain that Louis came to this country about 5 years ago, in a French vessel called the Pearl. She had lost her reckoning, and was driven by stress of weather into the port of St. Ives, in Cornwall. Louis and his 4 companions were brought to London upon a writ of habeas corpus at the instance of Mr. George Stephen, and, after some trifling opposition on the part of the master of the vessel, were discharged by Lord Winford. 2 of his unfortunate fellow sufferers died of the measles at Hampstead, the other 2 returned to Sierra Leone, but poor Louis, when offered the choice of going back to Africa, replied, "Me no father, no mother now, me stay with you." And here he has ever since remained, conducting himself in a way to gain the goodwill and respect of all who know him. He is remarkably intelligent, understands our language perfectly, and can read and write well. The last sentences of the following narrative will seem almost too peculiar to be his own, but it is not the first time that in conversation with Mr. George Stephen, he has made similar remarks. On one occasion in particular, he was heard saying to himself in the kitchen, while sitting by the fire apparently in deep thought, "Methink, a fellow servant inquired what he meant. And he added, "Methink what a good thing I came to England. Here, I know what God is, and read my Bible. In my country they have no God, no Bible." How severe and just a reproof to the guilty wretches who visit his country only with fire and sword. How deserved a censure upon the not less guilty men, who dare to vindicate the state of slavery, on the lying pretext, that its victims are of an inferior nature. And scarcely less deserving of reprobation are those who have it in their power to prevent these crimes, but who remain inactive from indifference, or are dissuaded from throwing the shield of British power over the victim of oppression. By the sophistry, and the clamor, and the avarice of the oppressor. It is the reproach and the sin of England. May God avert from our country the ruin which this national guilt deserves. We lament to add, that the pearl which brought these Negroes to our shore, was restored to its owners at the instance of the French government, instead of being condemned as a prize to Lieutenant Rye, who, on his own responsibility, detained her, with all her manacles and chains and other detestable proofs of her piratical occupation on board. We trust it is not yet too late to demand investigation into the reasons for restoring her. The Negro Boy's Narrative. My father's name was Clashikin, mine is Asa Asa. He lived in a country called Bykla, near Eg, a large town. Eg is as large as Brighton, it was some way from the sea. I had 5 brothers and sisters. We all lived together with my father and mother. He kept a horse, and was respectable, but not one of the great men. My uncle was one of the great men at Eg, he could make men come and work for him. His name was Otu. He had a great deal of land and cattle. My father sometimes worked on his own land, and used to make charcoal. I was too little to work, my eldest brother used to work on the land, and we were all very happy. A great many people, whom we called Adinis, set fire to Eg in the morning before daybreak. There were some thousands of them. They killed a great many, and burnt all their houses. They stayed 2 days, and then carried away all the people whom they did not kill. They came again every now and then for a month, as long as they could find people to carry away. They used to tie them by the feet, except when they were taking them off, and then they let them loose, but if they offered to run away, they would shoot them. I lost a great many friends and relations at Eg, about a dozen. They sold all they carried away, to be slaves. I know this because I afterwards saw them as slaves on the other side of the sea. They took away brothers, and sisters, and husbands, and wives. They did not care about this. They were sold for cloth or gunpowder, sometimes for salt or guns, sometimes they got 4 or 5 guns for a man. They were English guns, made like my master's that I cleaned for his shooting. The Adinis burnt a great many places besides Eg. They burnt all the country wherever they found villages. They used to shoot men, women, and children, if they ran away. They came to us about 11 o'clock one day, and directly they came they set our house on fire. All of us had run away. We kept together, and went into the woods, and stopped there 2 days. The Adinis then went away, and we returned home and found everything burnt. We tried to build a little shed, and were beginning to get comfortable again. We found several of our neighbors lying about wounded. They had been shot. I saw the bodies of 4 or 5 little children whom they had killed with blows on the head. They had carried away their fathers and mothers, but the children were too small for slaves, so they killed them. They had killed several others, but these were all that I saw. I saw them lying in the street like dead dogs. In about a week after we got back, the Adinis returned, and burnt all the sheds and houses they had left standing. We all ran away again. We went to the woods as we had done before. They followed us the next day. We went farther into the woods, and stayed there about 4 days and nights. We were half starved, we only got a few potatoes. My uncle Oda was with us. At the end of this time, the Adinis found us. We ran away. They called my uncle to go to them. But he refused, and they shot him immediately. They killed him. The rest of us ran on, and they did not get at us till the next day. I ran up into a tree, they followed me and brought me down. They tied my feet. I do not know if they found my father and mother, and brothers and sisters. They had run faster than me, and were half a mile farther when I got up into the tree. I have never seen them since. There was a man who ran up into the tree with me. I believe they shot him, for I never saw him again. They carried away about 20 besides me. They carried us to the sea. They did not beat us, they only killed one man, who was very ill and too weak to carry his load. They made all of us carry chickens and meat for our food, but this poor man could not carry his load, and they ran him through the body with a sword. He was a neighbor of ours. When we got to the sea they sold all of us, but not to the same person. They sold us for money, and I was sold 6 times over, sometimes for money, sometimes for cloth, and sometimes for a gun. I was about 13 years old. It was about half a year from the time I was taken, before I saw the white people. We were taken in a boat from place to place, and sold at every place we stopped at. In about 6 months we got to a ship, in which we first saw white people. They were French. They bought us. We found here a great many other slaves. There were about 80, including women and children. The Frenchmen sent away all but 5 of us into another very large ship. We 5 stayed on board till we got to England, which was about 5 or 6 months. The slaves we saw on board the ship were chained together by the legs below deck, so close they could not move. They were flogged very cruelly. I saw one of them flogged till he died. We could not tell what for. They gave them enough to eat. The place they were confined in below deck was so hot and nasty I could not bear to be in it. A great many of the slaves were ill, but they were not attended to. They used to flog me very bad on board the ship. The captain cut my head very bad one time. I am very happy to be in England, as far as I am very well, but I have no friend belonging to me, but God, who will take care of me as he has done already. I am very glad I have come to England, to know who God is. I should like much to see my friends again, but I do not now wish to go back to them, for if I go back to my own country, I might be taken as a slave again. I would rather stay here, where I am free, than go back to my country to be sold. I shall stay in England as long as, please God, I shall live. I wish the King of England could know all I have told you. I wish it that he may see how cruelly we are used. We had no king in our country, or he would have stopped it. I think the King of England might stop it, and this is why I wish him to know it all. I have heard say he is good. And if he is, he will stop it if he can. I am well off myself, for I am well taken care of, and have good bed and good clothes, but I wish my own people to be as comfortable. Louis Assa. London, January 31, 1831.